At the time of writing, there are 2,738 inmates on death row in the United States. This number can change quite frequently, given that some prisoners, of course, might be executed, but others might have their sentence commuted. They might have their sentence overturned, or someone else might join them on death row. Right now, only 2% of people on death row are women. 42% of people are classified as white, 41% black, 13% Latino, 1.9% Asian, 1% Native American, and the rest is stated as unknown. You can be on death row for a long, long time. And believe it or not, the average time spent there from sentencing to the day in the execution chamber is 20 years. Let's now see what happens on that final day, 8 p.m. The inmate is taken from death row to another cell. This involves a drive from the prison to what one former official in a documentary called the death house. That official said prior to leaving death row and getting in the van to come to the death house, the inmate will be searched really well. He said this wasn't only because a weapon might harm a guard, but mainly because they don't want the prisoner committing suicide. Another guard interviewed said he once took a route to the death house where they couldn't be ambushed. Tensions are high during these events. He also said the atmosphere in the van was solemn. We all knew where we were going and why. Nobody said a whole lot. Once the prisoner goes into the death house, he won't ever see the light of day again, unless some kind of appeal works for him. 9 p.m. After booking in, he can sleep until he's awakened, if indeed he can sleep. We managed to find the diary of one prisoner who described his move to his new cell. They stripped me out with a female officer present, he wrote. Now, personally, I'm not the shy type, but having a female officer on death watch is just one more humiliation. We're told that during this time, the prisoner is on something called death watch. He's watched all the time in case he tries to take his own life. The cell is close to the execution chamber and it is very private, a space where the inmate can reflect on life as the hours count down. This might happen just one day before, but we found cases where it was a couple of days. Prisoners will also be given special clothes in most cases, much smarter than prison attire. The man who kept the diary wrote he was happy to have at last a pair of trousers with a button and zip. We don't know how well he slept, but in his diary he comments about watching the guards sleep. This is what he wrote. Good for them. I'm sure this has to be stressful for them. So a moment's relaxation is well earned. I also enjoy the irony. Who exactly is watching whom? One other thing he says is that the death house is much cleaner than his death row cell. He remarks that there's not a bug in sight, whereas in his last cell it was like going on safari. 4:30 a.m. The inmate is woken up bright and early in his cell. We should add here times might change from place to place. Petitions might still be pending, and there's a phone right outside the cell. In the cell, there's a shower, a toilet, a bed, and a desk. During this last day, the prisoner is allowed to see family and can be visited by a chaplain. As for calling people, the inmate can write down a list of phone numbers he intends to call and give that to the guards. One guard interviewed said we would dial the number for him and then allow him to make his call. But after the prisoner has called the last person on his list, the only person he'll have to talk to is the chaplain. We're told that after this last call, it can be a very traumatic time. One chaplain interviewed said I was to do everything and anything to help him face that last day, whatever it was, writing letters, making phone calls, singing songs, listening, and listening. 8 a.m. We said they can have visitors, but 8 a.m. is the cutoff time. After that, the prisoner is on his own, besides having prison staff around and, of course, anyone involved in his case should something change. The chaplain can still visit too. At around this time, in the actual death chamber, it's very likely that the equipment will be tested. This might mean checking that the straps on the gurney work, or even checking the phone to the governor's office is working. Yep, imagine it wasn't and there was a last-minute reprieve. If the form of execution is the chair, then its electrical components have to be tested. In one case we found, the actual governor was the person who they strapped in to test if he could get out or move out of the straps. I didn't want my staff to get kicked in the face, he remarked. 10:30 a.m. Now it's lunchtime. Yes, this is an early lunch, but let's not forget the inmate has been up a long time already. Lunch is not special, it's not the last meal. From what we can see, it's the same old prison food. The only difference is that the prisoner gets to eat it in a private setting. The inmate we talked about before said what he got for lunch was orange juice and what he called a prison-issue donut. For quite a few hours now, the prisoner has a lot of time to think, and as you know, they have a desk and can write any number of letters, goodbyes, or just reflect on life. 3 p.m. If the inmate is to get the electric chair, he'll have his head shaved around this time. But this might also happen later in the day. he might still talk to a spiritual advisor. But food might also be on his mind right now. Around this time, maybe an hour or so later, the inmate will also be asked to dress in one of those smart clothes he's been given. He'll be asked to take a shower before he does this, a shower at least in total privacy. He'll have already written down what he wants to eat, so in the kitchen, the death house chef will be doing all the preparations. 4 p.m. The inmate will receive his last meal. Contrary to popular belief, inmates can't just order what they want. It makes sense because it's highly unlikely that authorities would splash out on the finest Wagyu beef. In Florida, for instance, the maximum this last meal can cost is $40, but this will change from state to state. Those poor convicts over in Oklahoma only get a limit of $15, or at least when one documentary we watched was made. That is hardly enough to go crazy on your last meal. It's still good though. As one death house chef pointed out, this meal is the only choice of food they might have had in 2 decades. In some states though, prisoners no longer get a bespoke last meal and only get the usual prison food. To give you an idea of what inmates might choose, we will list some last meals. Serial killer John Wayne Gacy had 12 fried shrimp, an entire bucket of KFC, some French fries, and a whole load of strawberries. The man behind the Oklahoma bombing, Timothy McVeigh, just opted for 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. A killer from Florida called Angel Nieves Diaz chose absolutely nothing. The terrible Ted Bundy did pretty much the opposite, ordering a steak cooked medium rare, eggs on the side, over easy, some hash browns, slices of toast, and some milk and juice. The infamous female serial killer Eileen Wuornos was good with just a cup of coffee, while a murderer called Stephen Woods must have been famished. We should add that many thought he was innocent and his last words were, "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder." Before that, he asked to eat, according to the website Ranker, 2 pounds of bacon, a large 4-meat pizza, 4 fried chicken breasts, 2 drinks each of Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea, 2 pints of ice cream, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers with bacon, fries, and a dozen garlic breadsticks with marinara on the side. That state must have had a big budget. 5 p.m. The witnesses will likely arrive at the prison. This might be family of the victims, journalists, family of the condemned, friends of the condemned, or whoever the condemned has asked to be witnesses. They will be told to try and stay quiet when they reach the witness room. Before that, they'll wait somewhere else. In most states, civilians who didn't know anyone involved will be asked to witness the execution. 6 to 8 p.m. The time of execution can vary from state to state, but it's just about always in the early evening. At this point, the prisoner will be taken to the execution room. The witnesses will soon be in the witness room. Prisoners, for the most part, will just walk right there and not give the guards any problems. In some states, this will be a 5-man team, just in case there is a struggle. But that doesn't happen often. One warden interviewed who had done 89 executions said he'd only had 1 prisoner that was hard to deal with. The walk to the chamber in most places is only about 10 feet, just over 3 meters. The guys would usually walk right up to the electric chair. They weren't forced by the staff. By that point, they've already accepted what will happen. A former Death Watch guard told Business Insider. Another guard in a separate interview said the same. Inmates usually act very dignified. It's a very clean procedure, there's no hustling and bustling. It's not always this way, especially if the prisoner is protesting his innocence. In 2018, the BBC reported that one man in Florida was screaming and thrashing before he was executed, screaming to everyone that they were murdering an innocent man. One warden said the first thing that catches his eye is that gurney, which is the place he's going to die. If it is lethal injection, which it often is, the prisoner is told to sit on the gurney and then lay down. There will be a tie-down team, each responsible for a part of the prisoner's body. Doctors will usually not be at the execution because it's not in line with their code of ethics, so there will be a special team to administer the drugs. This is not always easy as the veins tend to hide during this stressful time. Some of them had burnt veins from drugs, which would make the process longer and more painful, said one former warden. When the catheters are in place, the inmate will be secured again. There's about 15 minutes before the execution. Believe it or not, some inmates have got a stay, which means a call to stop the execution during these last minutes. If that doesn't happen, the witnesses are brought into the main room and the curtains are undrawn. Some inmates might make a final statement. It depends on the state, but some prisoners might be given a few minutes, and others just allowed to make a brief statement. Kentucky gives 2 minutes, but in Pennsylvania you can't talk at all, and the statement can only be written. Here are some fairly recent examples of last words. I'm ready to roll, time to get this party started. My last words will be, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Somebody needs to kill my trial attorney. I think that governor's phone is broke, he hasn't called yet. These are, of course, unusual ones, and most people will just say their goodbyes to loved ones or give an apology for what they did. At this point, the chaplain might lay a hand on the prisoner, sometimes where there's a pulse. The warden will give the signal to the executioner, and then it's time. The end of the day, the end of a life. The convict slams his handcuffed fists down on a table and shouts at the two detectives sitting opposite, "I kill kings and presidents first, and next all capitalists." He has no remorse whatsoever for the crimes he's committed. "Give me 100 years, he later screams at a judge. His story involves a dead mayor, an assassination attempt on the president-to-be, and some famous last words, "Push the button. Go ahead, push the button." It was this man, an avowed king killer, a wishful slayer of presidents, that changed everything. He alone was the reason why death row became a thing in the United States. There are about 2,500 people on death row in the US as you watch this. There have been 5 executions so far this year, although some people will have uttered their last words by the time the show comes out. 14 people are scheduled to die before 2021 is over. They are all male. They will all receive a lethal injection. They are mostly from the states of Texas and Oklahoma, and they are a mix of ethnicities. Gone are the days when a person could be convicted and end up on the scaffold or in the death chamber just a few days or weeks later. Combined, the 5 people executed so far in 2021 have served 96 years on death row. So, this brings us back to how death row got started and the fascinating story of Giuseppe Zangara. He was born in Italy on September 1, 1900. He served in the First World War and later emigrated to the USA. He also became the man that very nearly made sure that Franklin D. Roosevelt, often said to be one of the best presidents in U.S. history, never even became president. His parents were peasants living in an area that is the toe on that boot of Italy. His mother believed he was cursed as a kid, mainly because he was born with an ear defect and because he always was having accidents. He was badly injured after falling down some steps. He was burned in a fire. He then fell down more stairs, and he still wasn't yet 8 years old. Young Giuseppe didn't go to school for any length of time because his father made him work in the fields. Life was hard, and his ill-tempered father didn't make it any easier. He didn't really blame his father. His anger focused on the system he and his family were enmeshed in, that of capitalism. And then he arrived in the United States of America, the land of milk and honey, a country where anyone could make it regardless of their class. Well, that's what people were led to believe. Zangara arrived in this land of plenty in 1923, the beginning of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans could barely find enough food to sustain a decent life. On top of that, he had chronic stomach pains. He'd seen doctors about this back in Italy, and the pains were likely the result of his child labor and other maltreatment during his youth. A doctor once turned to his father and said, "This boy will never be any good again." Zangara was angry, in pain, and in the wrong place at the wrong time. America wasn't gonna save a wretch like him. This is what he wrote in his memoir. It sums up his mindset at the time. "The capitalists get to be the boss to my father, keep the money from my father, and my father sent me to work, and I have no school, and I have trouble with my stomach, and that way I make my idea to kill the president, kill any president, any king." He actually tried to assassinate Victor Emmanuel III of Italy back in 1923, but he didn't even get off a shot. He later explained, "The guards got in front of me and I could not get at him because the guards were over 6 feet tall, and I could not even see the king." He discovered again that being short got in the way of being a successful assassin. It was just after his lackluster attempt on someone's life that he applied for a visa to go live in the US. As we said, he was expecting milk and honey, equality for all, vast landscapes of manicured gardens. And once he got off the boat, a pat in the back from Uncle Sam and all those nice natives. Things didn't exactly work out that way. At first he did okay, working as a bricklayer in New Jersey. His constant stomach issues ensured he didn't waste money on booze or gambling. He didn't have many friends and he never dated women. His uncle in the US later condensed his nephew's life, saying he wanted to be left alone to suffer with his stomach. Then came the Great Depression. Work dried up in New Jersey. He traveled to LA to look for another job, hoping the warmer climate might be better for his stomach problem. There was no work there either. He then moved to Miami, where he earned a meager wage as a dishwasher. He ate a meal of scraps once a day, and when he had a few cents to spare, he gambled that on dogs or horses. His American dream had turned into an American nightmare. So he did what anyone would do, sort of, and blamed the president. Sat in his squalid room holding his damn stomach, he made plans to assassinate President Herbert Hoover. Only Hoover was in Washington, D.C. and it was cold there. Then, just as soon as he lamented his delicate disposition, he heard a newsboy shout something below his window. "President-elect Franklin Delano Roosevelt to visit Miami. Read all about it." Zangara clambered out to the street and bought a newspaper. He learned that Roosevelt would arrive in Miami and later head to Bayfront Park, where he would make a speech. Perfect, he thought. If I can't get the current president, I'm going to get the next best thing. Truth be known, he actually quite liked Roosevelt. Still, in his mind, all capitalist politicians deserve to die. A few minutes later, Zangara was in Davis Pawn Shop buying a .32 caliber revolver and 10 bullets. He paid $8. That was pretty much all the money he had in the world, but he wasn't thinking about his future at this point. On February 15, 1933, he put the loaded gun into his pocket and he headed out the door. As he made his way to the park, more than 25,000 other people from all over the U.S. were doing the same. Bands at the park were getting ready to play when Zangara's 5'1" frame tried to squeeze his way through the crowd toward a seat close to where Roosevelt would make his speech on the podium. And he would have gotten closer if it weren't for a Mr. H.L. Edmonds of Ottumwa, Iowa. As he was pushing through the crowd, Edmonds grabbed him and sternly told him that the front seats were for women and children. Zangara didn't argue, resigning himself to a third-row seat and the fact that he would now require good aim. No problem, he thought. He'd shot guns enough in the war. At around 9:30 a.m., Roosevelt made a short speech, after which a group of people shook his hand and had an informal chit-chat with him. One of them was Anton Cermak, the mayor of Chicago. At this point, Zangara was trying his best to get into position, which wasn't easy given he couldn't quite see over the heads of the people much taller than himself. He had no choice but to position himself on a bench, one that wasn't too stable. Then he got his chance, seeing the back of the head of the president-elect. Bang, 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 bang. He fired all 5 shots, each just missing Roosevelt. He did hit someone with each bullet, though, including Mayor Cermak. The bullet entered his chest under his armpit and lodged in his lung. Mrs. Joseph H. Gill took a bullet to the abdomen. 3 others, Mr. Russell Caldwell, Miss Margaret Cruis, and Mr. William J. Sinnott, were also shot, but they all survived. It was nothing short of a miracle that Roosevelt wasn't hit. Later, Lillian Cross and Thomas Armour said they had seen what was happening and managed to push Zangara enough so he couldn't aim directly at Roosevelt. This is debatable, however. Zangara told detectives that the bench he was standing on moved and that's why he'd missed. Had that bench not have wobbled, he was certain he would have found Roosevelt's head. With Roosevelt now under a mass of people trying to protect him, Zangara was wrestled to the ground and arrested. Cops didn't waste much time, thinking the guy would have likely been lynched by the angry crowd. They tied him to the trunk rack of one of the limousines from the motorcade and sped off. The furious crowd ran after it, screaming for the blood of the would-be assassin. From his jail cell, Zangara said his only regret was that he had missed. He told cops that he didn't so much hate Roosevelt, but the fact that he was to become president of the capitalist nation. All the time he was being interviewed, he was clutching his stomach. After 2 psychiatrists visited him, they wrote a report. It stated, his intelligence is not necessarily inferior, his distorted judgment and temperament is incapable of adjustment to the average social standards. He is inherently suspicious and antisocial. Such ill-balanced erratic types are classified as a psychopathic personality. He might not have been psychopathic. These days, an assessment would more likely have said he had a severe personality disorder, partly a consequence of his traumatic upbringing, made worse by a very painful stomach ailment. Not having work was the final straw, but Zangara was always going to explode at some point. On February 20th, 1933, he pled guilty to 4 counts of assault and an assassination attempt. Judge E.C. Collins handed Zangara 80 years, to which he responded, 4 times 20 is 80. Oh, Judge, don't be stingy, give me 100 years. But then Cermak died from his injuries, so now the sentence was murder under something called transferred intent. He might not have intended to kill Cermak, but under this doctrine, he should have known he might kill someone else while trying to kill his target. This meant his intent was transferred, and so in legal terms, he meant to kill Cermak. Circuit Court Judge Uli Thompson then passed down the death sentence. Zangara didn't seem fazed at all, telling the judge, "You give me electric chair. I no afraid of that chair. You're one of the capitalists. You is crook man too. Put me in electric chair. I no care." Thing was, under Florida law, murderers could not share a cell. This was a problem, because there was already a guy in the death cell waiting execution. The prison had no choice but to build another cell next to it. Hence, the death cell was now death row. Just before Zangara went to the chair, he passed a bunch of notes to prison officials. These were part of his biography. The chaplain then came to calm him down. But Zangara got angry and chased him out of the room, shouting, "Get to hell out of here, you son of a, I go sit down all by myself." We think you can fill in that missing word by yourself. It seems Angara despised all authority. He sat in the electric chair smiling but became incensed when he discovered his final moments wouldn't be photographed or filmed. That's when he said, "Viva l'Italia! Goodbye to all poor peoples everywhere. Push the button. Go ahead, push the button." No one claimed the body, so he was buried in the prison grounds. What's perhaps surprising is the pathologist said Zangara's brain showed no sign of disease or injury, and neither did his stomach. By this time, Roosevelt was already sworn in as president. He would be re-elected for 3 more terms. The US and even the world might have been a different place today if little Giuseppe Zangara had been just a few inches taller. Late last evening, you were taken from your cell on death row to the death house, the room condemned prisoners stay in before they finally receive that ultimate punishment. Your stay will be short, but at least you have your own bathroom. A guard sits outside your cell at all times because you're on what's called death watch. Nobody wants you to have the chance to take your own life and rob them of the spectacle tomorrow. You wake up on the big day, say your goodbyes to your loved ones, maybe phone some friends. You have a word with the chaplain perhaps, and then it's just you alone with your thoughts. There will be no you in just a few hours. And the last real decision you'll ever make is what you want to eat for your final meal. At this restaurant, the final check is permanent, but at least you don't have to pay. But what are some of the craziest last meals prisoners have requested? Before we get into the wildest last meal requests, there are some things you should know about these very peculiar restaurants. You might be thinking you can order what you want, so what about a $200 piece of Japanese Kobe beef and some caviar on the side, perhaps washed down with a bottle of Dom Perignon? Unfortunately, the American prison system doesn't show that kind of largesse. There is a limit as to how much you can spend, and that varies wildly from state to state. For instance, Florida is apparently quite kind, giving prisoners a $40 budget. But in tight-fisted Oklahoma, you only get $15. Worst still is Texas, which in 2011 got rid of the last meal altogether and told the condemned that regular prison food will have to do. Come on, Texas, where's your heart? Guess which state has the most executions too? Yep, it's Texas. Since 2012, 84 folks have met their maker with only a belly full of standard-issue prison slop. You get the picture. Prisoners have to work with what they've got. Historically speaking, though, the budgets have changed over time, and sometimes there's not even a budget at all. But the request must be reasonable. We'll stay with one of the most well-known convicts to be executed, the killer clown John Wayne Gacy. This serial killer murdered scores of young people after he lured them into his house, where he kept them captive. Gacy is relatively unusual for a serial killer because he was a successful businessman and a pillar of the community. So trusted he often did his Pogo the Clown routine for the neighborhood kids. And before his lethal injection in 1994, he certainly put on a show as well. For his last meal, he had 12 deep-fried shrimp, a whole bucket full of chicken from KFC, fries, a pound of strawberries, and a bottle of Diet Coke. Maybe he was watching his weight. You might not have heard of Marion Albert Pruitt. He went on a robbing rampage in the 80s that left 5 people dead. This man was what you might call a fast food fan, and we wonder if he was even able to finish his last meal. He ordered a whole Pizza Hut stuffed crust pizza, 4 Whoppers from Burger King. Yes, we said 4. But he also ordered large fries, some eggplant squash and okra, all washed down with 3 2-liter bottles of Pepsi. That wasn't quite enough, so he had pecan pie for dessert. And he's far from the only one who got greedy with his last meal. Robert Alton Harris, who was found guilty of murdering 2 teenagers in 1978, ordered 21 pieces of KFC chicken in a bucket, 2 large Domino's pizzas with no anchovies, a tub of ice cream, a bag of jelly beans, and a 6-pack of Pepsi. But what about the people who wanted something special rather than a massive mashup of junk food and sugary drinks? Are there no refined condemned killers? Actually, there are, and one example is Robert Dale Conklin. In the 2000s, he stabbed his lover to death with a screwdriver and then chopped up the body. If he could stomach that, he certainly could get a meal down before his death. For his last meal, he asked for a bacon-wrapped filet mignon steak. He wanted sautéed shrimp, deveined of course, in garlic butter with lemon on the side. He wanted a baked potato filled with sour cream, chives, bacon bits, and hollandaise sauce. He also wanted bread, but it had to be a French baguette, buttered and filled with goat cheese. For dessert, he asked for cantaloupe, apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. His drink of choice was iced tea. You might be wondering which state would pay for all that, and the answer is Georgia. So if you're going to get the death sentence and you call yourself a foodie, make sure you do it there. Ronnie Lee Gardner was a death row rarity, as one of the few people in recent times to be executed by firing squad. In 2010, before he had to eat a bullet, he ordered surf and turf, lobster and steak. To drink, he wanted 7-Up, and for dessert, vanilla ice cream. Gardner, who was accused of having shot a man in the face during a robbery, had one more request. He asked if while eating his last meal, he could watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy, a cunning plan to delay the execution, but we can't find any sources that reveal if he made it through all 3 films. Then we have the carnivores, the ones that just need their meat. One such was Stephen Michael Woods Jr., who was infamously executed in 2011, a controversial case with many believing he was innocent. He's also famous for his last words: "You're not about to witness an execution, you're about to witness a murder." We won't dive into the details of this case in this episode, and whether he may have been innocent or not, but we do know for sure that he loved meat. For his final meal, he requested 2 pounds, yes, pounds of bacon. With that, he wanted 4 fried chicken breasts. He wasn't on a low-carb diet though, because he also got a pizza. What topping? If you guessed more meat, then you're right. 4 kinds to be precise. He wasn't done though. He also ordered 2 hamburgers, french fries, 12 garlic breadsticks with dip, 2 pints of ice cream, and a selection of drinks including Mountain Dew and Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea. Then you've got the people who know exactly what they want and don't go for the smorgasbord of treats. The man behind the Oklahoma City bombing, Timothy McVeigh, only wanted a couple of pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. Murderer Dobie Gillis Williams, who was executed in 1999, also wanted to go out on a sugar high. All he asked for were 12 chocolate bars with some ice cream and coconut pie. Gerald Lee Mitchell, who was only 17 when the murder he was convicted of took place, also wanted candy for his last meal, ordering only a bag of Jolly Ranchers. The murderer Victor Feger, who was hanged in 1963 and was the last person put to death in Iowa, had one of the smallest orders of all time: 1 olive. Yep, a single olive. But he said he only wanted it on the condition that the pit was left in, and surprisingly, he isn't the only one to make this order. Robert Anthony Buell, who was convicted of kidnapping and killing young girls in the 1980s, asked for the same thing: 1 olive, pit in, of course. But our vote for the most minimalistic order ever came from James Edward Smith, who shot and killed a man during a robbery, a crime for which he was executed in 2000. For his last meal, all he wanted was a pile of dirt. Some have speculated that he wanted the dirt for a voodoo ritual, which he performed in his cell to prevent himself from becoming a ghost. But the ceremony never came to pass, as the prison denied the request, and instead of the dirt, he was given a cup of yogurt. Odell Barnes Jr. wanted a whole lot more, but also a whole lot less at the same time. He was convicted of murder in 2000 and sentenced to death. The evidence surrounding this crime was controversial, and his case became a focal point for the debate over capital punishment. This is another case we won't explore in this episode, but for his last meal he ordered justice, equality, world peace. Other prisoners have tried to do or say nice things with their final moments. Philip Workman robbed a Wendy's restaurant in 1982 and shot a policeman. He was executed in 2007 and actually declined his last meal, but asked the prison to order a vegetarian pizza and give it to a homeless person. Any homeless person, in fact. The prison refused, but people heard about his request, and all across the USA, thousands of pizzas were donated to homeless shelters. The prison doesn't always get the order right either, as happened with murderer Thomas J. Grasso, who was executed in 1995. His last meal was quite extravagant, and it's clear he was a fan of seafood. He wanted 24 steamed mussels and 24 steamed clams. On top of that, he wanted a double cheeseburger from Burger King and some barbecued spare ribs. He went overboard for dessert, asking for half a pumpkin pie with whipped cream, diced strawberries, and 2 strawberry milkshakes. They got all of that correct, but managed to mess up maybe the most important thing. He was given a plate of spaghetti, when what he actually asked for was a can of SpaghettiOs. David Leon Woods had one of the strangest requests for a last meal before his execution on May 4, 2007, a birthday cake. His birthday had been a month earlier, so maybe this was a belated gift to himself? He also ordered a pizza and shared his last meal with his family. Believe it or not, there's a fairly long list of people who have survived their executions. We might look at the case of William Duell, a 17-year-old English boy who was hanged in 1740 in London and then came back to life as he was about to be dissected. He was later exiled to North America. Then you had John Babacombe Lee, another Englishman nicknamed the man they couldn't hang, after surviving 3 executions. More recently, you have the case of Rommel Broom, an American man sentenced to death by lethal injection. He survived that, ended up writing a book called Survivor on Death Row, but it seems he spoke too early, as he's scheduled for another execution in 2020. But today we'll talk about one of the best-known survivor stories in this episode of the Infographics Show, death row inmate who survived his own execution. As we've said, a handful of people have survived their executions. You can read quite recent cases too, such as American inmate Doyle Lee Ham, who was said to have experienced torturous and traumatic hours in the execution chamber before staff admitted that they had failed. The US media reported in 2017 that a man called Alva Campbell became the third man to survive an execution in the country in recent decades, and that was just a matter of the execution team not being able to find a vein in which to inject the lethal drugs. But perhaps the tale we're about to tell you now is the most moving, as the person that survived was only 17 years old. It's also the first case of someone surviving the electric chair in the USA. If you've seen our show on Old Sparky, you'll know that executions in the early days could certainly be horrific to watch, but eventually the inmates succumbed to the shock. That was not the case for 17-year-old Willie Francis. Let's have a look at what events led to him ending up in the chair. Francis was a young, poor African-American in 1946, and at the time of his lucky escape, many people believed that the hand of God had interrupted this macabre spectacle of official murder. For one thing, he was just so young, and a lot of people decreed the execution of a boy not yet a man. And another thing was the fact that the American justice system at the time could have been said to be harsh for certain people of certain races and certain social standing. He lived in a place called St. Martinville, located in southwestern Louisiana. You can read articles about this place in the 40s, with one saying that the town had two sections, one for the white people and the other for the colored. The white tended to their own business and the colored tended to theirs. Yes, this was a time when racism was pervasive in some parts of the US, and despite the backwards attitudes of some people, there was a lot of support for young Willie when he was condemned to death. After the botched execution attempt, Francis wrote from his prison cell, "A lot of people write me to ask me to tell them something about what I did when I was young. I'm only 18 now, so I guess they mean when I was very young. But what had he done?" One of 13 children, Francis said life was hard as a kid, but he wrote he had fond memories of the hard-knock life, playing baseball with a broomstick handle, and going out with friends causing mischief. When he got older, he was given a job by a man called Andrew Thomas. Thomas owned the local drugstore, hiring Francis to do errands and keep the store tidy. They apparently got along, and Francis was called a nice boy and cooperative by folks who visited the store. He was, however, called illiterate by some, or at least close to that. Others said he was slow, but later when Francis was writing from his prison cell, it was proven that he could not just write, but express himself in a deep and meaningful way. We're telling you this because this case was very controversial, and at the time and for years after, people tried to understand why this seemingly nice kid committed a murder. That murder was of the drugstore owner, Thomas. When her son was convicted of slaying his boss, the mother told the press, "There wasn't no bad in him, I just don't understand." Quite a few people thought that this young boy, perhaps somewhat mentally challenged, had admitted guilt to something he didn't do, the murder of Andrew Thomas. Described as a handsome, educated bachelor with his own successful business, he was killed at his home during that night of November 7th, 1944. His body was discovered the next day, splayed on the floor near the house steps. Two witnesses, Alvin and Ida Van Brocklin, had said that they heard gunshots in the night. They didn't see who did the firing though. It was later said that Thomas had been dining with friends and upon returning home had been met by a gunman who unloaded 5 bullets in him. 2 hit him in the back, 2 in his left side, and 1 went right through his eye. It said his pockets had been emptied, prompting police to say the reason for the murder was robbery. Rumors spread around town. It said he was quite the ladies' man, and many speculated he had been killed by one of those ladies' husbands or lovers. For months, people believed this to be the case. Sometime later, police were looking for a drug dealer, and it said that Willie Francis just happened to see the police. He wasn't dealing drugs, but it said that when he saw the 2 white police officers running his way, he just took off out of fright. That was a mistake, as running made the police think that he was guilty of something. Later, Francis was interviewed by cops at the police station. They said he seemed frightened and he stuttered a lot, but it turned out that Francis had stuttered his whole life. The cops didn't think that they had captured a drug dealer that they had been looking for, but guess what they found on Francis? They found Andrew Thomas's wallet and identification card. That's what they said anyway. It said that within 3 to 5 minutes, the police got a full confession for the murder of Thomas. They also managed to get a confession for an unrelated assault and robbery in another town. The facts cops did this in a few minutes, and the fact that the boy was said to be somewhat slow would compel people to ask if the interrogation and subsequent confessions were perhaps a part of a setup. Francis was questioned without a lawyer, without any advice, without any family member or friend being present. The confession read,
I, Willie Francis, now 16 years old, I stole the gun from Mr. Ogassie at St. Martinville, Louisiana, and kill Andrew Thomas November 9, 1944, or about that time at St. Martinville, Louisiana. It was a secret about me and him. I took a black purse with card 1280182 in it, $4 in it. He wrote a second confession the next day. This one contained more details about how many shots had been fired and where the body was found. As for the trial, it said Francis's lawyers were inept. One writer says they never questioned for indictment, nor did they make a motion for a change of venue, despite the widespread publicity about the murder of a beloved white member of a small community by a black youth. The 12 white jurors found him guilty, and he was to be executed. Francis' lawyers never challenged the verdict. By the way, Francis has pleaded not guilty. The jury never heard any argument pertaining to the possibility of a forced confession or that evidence could have been planted. The confession itself was good enough for him to be convicted. Many people in the town thought that something smelled funny, as did many others across the U.S. The local press wrote, quote, "Throughout the trial, the Negro was uninterested and showed very little emotion," unquote. Francis wrote that he was concerned that he might act like a crybaby on the day of his execution, but was relieved to hear that the actual execution would only tickle. On May 3, 1946, he had his head shaved and prepared to have 2,500 volts of electricity flow through him. On his cell wall, it was discovered that he had written the words, "Of course I am not a killer." Police never did have a motive for the murder, nor any substantial evidence other than the confession of a slow 16-year-old boy. He was taken to Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola to be put in the chair nicknamed Gruesome Gertie. The lever was pulled, and this is how Francis later described the feeling. "I couldn't stop the jumping. If that was tickling, it sure was a funny kind. I thought for a minute I was going to knock the chair over. Then I was all right. I thought I was dead." Other reports state that he shouted, take it off," as the executioners tried to give him a second round of shocks. It's said that after the failed attempt, he wasn't even injured, but he said he felt kind of dizzy. Some people said this was a miracle and a righteous one, as they didn't believe that he was guilty nor had a fair trial. Louisiana's Governor James Davis then said in 6 days they would send him to the chair again. That didn't happen, and much of America got behind the young man. He once wrote, "I felt just like a movie star. I didn't have any idea I had so many friends." He also later described how his execution felt and something he called the chair. He wrote, "You feel like you got a mouthful of cold peanut butter, and you see little blue and pink and green speckles, the kind that shines in a rooster's tail." What ensued were many months of legal arguments. Not only did some people believe he wasn't even, but lawyers now argued that to subject a person to a second execution was cruel and unusual punishment. Prosecution lawyers argued against that, stating the first attempt had not worked at all and he had not been hurt. But the evidence supporting this in hindsight seems pretty weak. The court also heard that the botch was just an accident, and such accidents happen for which no man is to blame. That meant no one was at fault, and there should be another execution. We might also note that later the state was petitioned, with lawyers stating this about the botched execution: "The scene was a disgraceful and inhuman exhibition. That as soon as the switch controlling the current was taken off, the drunken executioner cursed Francis and told him he would be back to finish electrocuting him. And if the electricity did not kill him, he would kill him with a rock." The drunken men in charge that night were accused of being sadistic, not giving Francis the full shock because they wanted to torture him. He was then returned to the chair on May 9, 1947, and this time he didn't survive. He was just 18 years old. If anything positive came out of all of this, it's the fact that the justice system was exposed for not supporting Francis in the first place. This poor black boy may or may not have killed his boss, but he certainly wasn't protected as he should have been by the American justice system. Many Americans of all colors saw and criticized what had happened.
You would think that when strapped to a gurney, knowing the life force in you is about to expire, you'd want to say something nice to someone, or profound, or perhaps apologize to the family of the victim that's watching your demise. Then again, if you were an innocent person about to have his veins filled with a lethal cocktail, you might not be in the mood to deliver a tender speech. You might also be a ruthless and heartless psychopath that wants to fill the air one last time with your monstrous voice. As you'll now find out, that has happened, and it might send shivers down your spine hearing what they said. First up, Richard Aaron Cobb. Cobb was executed by lethal injection in 2013 in Texas. His crime was walking into a convenience store with an accomplice and robbing it. It didn't stop there. They took 2 female employees and 1 male customer and forced them into a car. They took them to a secluded place and shot them execution style, and then drove away thinking they were all dead. Only the man actually died. His last words were very strange, starting out nihilistic. He then finished with something very surprising. "I hope that someday this absurdity that humanity has come to will come to an end." And then seconds later, after he started to pass away, Wow, this is great. Thank you, Warden. This next one is slightly more gruesome. John Wayne Gacy. You all know the story of this man, and we won't go into detail about what he did. He murdered 33 people in the 70s and hid many of the bodies under his house. He is one of the USA's worst serial killers. His last words show that he had no remorse whatsoever. They were, "Kiss my..." We can't say that last word, otherwise the video will get demonetized. But we are sure you can guess what it is. There's no cursing in this next one, but we think you'll agree it's pretty darn dark. Peter Kürten. You've never heard of this guy, we bet. He was a German serial killer at a time where there were few of them about in Germany. That was the early 20th century. He killed at least 9 people and did terrible things with the bodies. One other thing was that he drank the blood of his victims, and that's why he was sometimes named the Vampire of Dusseldorf. In 1931, he was beheaded by guillotine, and just before that happened, he looked at his psychiatrist and said, "Tell me, after my head has been chopped off, will I still be able to hear, at least for a moment, the sound of my own blood gushing from the stump of my neck? That would be the pleasure to end all pleasures." Before the blade came down, the psychiatrist replied, "No." Eileen Wuornos. This woman you might have seen portrayed in a Hollywood movie called Monster. She worked selling her body on the streets and killed 6 of her male customers. She claims she was defending herself, but that didn't hold up in court. She's now known as one of America's worst female serial killers. She was executed in 2002, and just before that, she promised she'd come back to life again. She said, "I'd just like to say I'm sailing with the rock, and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus June 6th, like the movie, big mothership and all. I'll be back." Sticking with serial murderers, this next monster fits the bill. Carl Panzram. This guy was a serial killer in the US at the start of the 20th century. He committed murders among many other despicable things. He said he had killed 22 people in all. He was sentenced to be hanged in 1930, and just before the executioner put the cover on his head, he spat in his face. He was asked if he had any last words. This is how he replied, "Yes, hurry it up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill a dozen men while you're screwing around." In case you're wondering, a Hoosier is someone from the state of Indiana. Up next is arguably the funniest on this list, James French. French killed 2 people in the late 50s and mid-60s in the USA. One of those people was his cellmate. The two didn't get along very well. His actual last words when sitting in the electric chair were, "There's nothing else to say." But the last thing he said to a reporter was this, "If I were covering my execution, do you know what I'd say in the newspaper headline tomorrow?" The reporter said, "What?" He answered, "French fries." Yep, that was amusing. We think this next guy was also attempting to make a joke. Jeffrey Matthews. Matthews shot and killed his uncle during a robbery, and he was executed in 2011 in Oklahoma because of that. His last words aren't exactly frightening, but his dark sense of humor at the end is perhaps a little bit shocking. He said a few things, but his very last words were, "I think that governor's phone is broke. He hasn't called yet." Robert Charles Comer. You can say the same about this man. At the end, he either had a twisted sense of humor or was on another planet, mentally speaking. In 1987, he killed a man, but he'd also committed some other serious crimes throughout his life. When he asked if he wanted to say something at the end, he said, "Go Raiders." That's in reference to an American football team. Such a statement, you might assume, encapsulates how little he thought about himself and life and his victims. Robert Alton Harris. Alton was executed in California in 1992 for multiple murders. He'd been a career criminal with a long rap sheet, although his killing of 2 boys is why he got the gas chamber. He was incredibly heartless if you read his story, but we won't go into it today. At the end, he became poetic, his last words being, "You can be a king or a street sweeper, but everybody dances with the Grim Reaper." He's not wrong about that. He's not as amusing as the next person, though. Vincent Gutierrez. This guy was executed in Texas in 2007 after being found guilty of killing a man. Gutierrez had been trying to steal the man's car and then shot him in the back. He was under the age of 18 when it happened. He said a few things for his last words and apologized for what he had done. But then he finished it off by saying, "Where's my stunt double when you need one?" John William Rook. Rook believed his difficult childhood was the reason he committed a murder in 1980 in the US. He had 12 hot dogs for his last meal. And then, just before they took his life away, he thanked them and said, "Freedom, freedom at last." James W. Rogers. Rogers was sentenced to death after killing a fellow worker at a uranium mine in 1957. The two had fallen out over quite a big issue, and that was how a scoop shovel should be properly greased. They didn't see eye to eye regarding the grease, and Rogers shot the other man. He was sentenced to death by firing squad. When Rogers was ready to have the firing squad finish his life, He was asked if he had any final words. His reply was, "I done told you my last request, a bulletproof vest." Charlie Livingston. In 1983, this man shot and killed a woman in Houston during a robbery. He didn't seem to see the point of final words when the time came, and he made that point, saying, "You all brought me here to be executed, not to make a speech. That's it." That was simple enough, quite different from what's coming up. Douglas Roberts. This man from Texas was quite the opposite, and he had quite a lot to say on the day of his execution by lethal injection in 2005. He'd been found guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and murder. When the time came for his last words, he said, "I've been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I leave, I want to tell you all, when I die, bury me deep, lay 2 speakers at my feet, put some headphones on my head, and rock and roll me when I'm dead." The media later reported that he was upbeat and animated before his execution. Frederick Wood. Wood was another joker, albeit with a dark sense of humor. He was put to the electric chair in 1963 for the crime of murder. When asked what his final words would be, he replied, "Gents, this is an educational project. You're about to witness the damaging effect electricity has on wood." The next couple of people you could say are unique on this list. Mary Blandy. Now we're going really back in time, and this is the story of an Englishwoman whose father didn't approve of her relationship. She looked to poison to deal with this problem. She was hanged in 1752, and at the time she was wearing a dress. She was worried people might look up the dress, even though it wouldn't matter much after she was dead. Still, she told the executioner, "For the sake of decency, gentlemen, don't hang me high." Sarah Good. Now we go even farther back to the Salem trials in Massachusetts in 1692. Good was in her 30s when she was accused of being a witch and then sentenced to death. All 12 jurors agreed that she had to be a witch. She was accused of lacking in self-discipline and being a servant of the devil. She had only challenged locals regarding their very strict Puritan values, but they had said that made her in league with Satan. The Reverend Nicholas Noyes was there at the end and still tried to get her to confess, and she of course refused. Her last words were, "I'm no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." 25 years later, Noyes had an aneurysm, and as the story goes, he coughed up blood and choked on it. We should say this is what's called popular legend. But as the witch trials were so terrible, we imagine many people might hope it happened. While these witch trials were madness to the highest degree, Mary's husband at least sued the courts for what's happened to her, and he won. Now we go back to the present day and a couple of guys that look death straight in the eye. Clarence Ray Allen. This man was executed in California for killing 3 people. He was executed in 2006 when he was the ripe old age of 76. He was very sick at the time, and a lot of people wondered why the death sentence, since it seemed he didn't have much time left anyway. His last words were, "Hoka hey, it's a good day to die." Melvin White. White had committed the terrible crime of murdering a child, and he was executed in Texas in 2005. We won't go into the details, but what he did shocked a lot of people. Not many folks felt sorry for this man as he went to the gurney for his dose of lethal drugs. He did say he was sorry for what he did and then said, "All right, Warden, let's give them what they want." The next couple of people you might say didn't sit too well in their chair of death. Tory Twain McNabb. In 2017, this man was given lethal injection in the state of Alabama. He'd been convicted of killing a police officer. He and his lawyers had tried to stop it going through by saying the punishment was cruel and unusual, but that didn't work. He went to the gurney an angry man, and with both his hands, he pointed 2 middle fingers in the air. He then said, "Mom, sis, look at my eyes. I got no tears. I'm unafraid. To the state of Alabama, I hate you. I hate you. I hate you." Thomas J. Grasso. We have perhaps saved the strangest last words to last. And this was the execution of a man that had been convicted of 2 murders of elderly women. He was given lethal injection in the state of Oklahoma in 1995. He wrote a short poem before his death, and part of it went like this: "The warden will read my last creed, and the deadly brew will flow, as the poison drips into my veins, and from my body life does drain." But his last words were in the form of a very practical complaint. We guess he was being ironic. Those words were, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs. I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this." You wake up with a start. You were sleeping soundly, but now all you can think about is the workday ahead. It's not an ordinary workday, you think, as you look at yourself in the mirror. You haven't been sleeping well, and you can see it all over your face. You're a death row executioner, and your moment has come. Today, you go to the prison and play your role in administering capital punishment. Today, you're going to put a convicted murderer to death. When you joined the Prisons Bureau as a corrections officer, this wasn't the first thing on your mind. But as you rose in the ranks and were assigned to the maximum security prisons where they needed your experience, you often found yourself stationed on death row. This is where the inmates awaiting execution are kept under the most secure conditions, only let out for limited exercise time and kept away from other inmates. Most inmates stay on death row for years, often decades, as their lawyers appeal through the courts. The shortest time on death row in Texas in the modern era is 252 days. But some inmates have died in prison after being there for over 30 years. When those appeals run out and the time to an execution ticks down, though, the prison prepares to make sure everything goes off perfectly. Part of that is picking the executioners. The executioners are usually chosen from a pool of the correction officers working at the prison, and they'll ask for volunteers. If there are no volunteers, the prison will typically pick from the staff of officers and make sure that they don't have strong moral objections. The executioner will work closely with the prison's death team, which is responsible for preparing the death chamber, making sure the inmate is secure, and taking care of all the inmate's rights before they face justice. But it wasn't always this way, you think to yourself. When you first volunteered to be one of the prison's executioners, you found yourself looking up the history of the profession. An executioner used to be a very hands-on profession, dating back to ancient times, when the executioner would deliver death personally and brutally. In fact, the executioner used to be known as a headsman for the most common method of execution, beheading. Common in medieval times, the executioner was often a big, brawny man capable of swinging an axe with great force. The goal was to take the condemned's head off with a single clean stroke, often in front of hundreds of onlookers. Most executioners carried out this duty effectively, but there were exceptions, like the notorious John Ketch. An official executioner in England in 1663, he didn't have the sure swing needed for the job and often took as many as 8 swings to take a person's head off. This made for a bloody and horrific show, and the people who watched were disgusted. After the backlash against him, he wrote a letter defending himself and blamed the executed Lord Russell for his own botched execution. But after another similar failure, John Ketch was nearly lynched by the public and had to be ushered away by guards. He was so despised for his brutality that his name became synonymous with Satan in English lore. But time marched on, and so did the death penalty. Soon the axe and the basket were replaced by more technical methods of execution, starting with the gallows and the guillotine. Hanging and beheading were common methods of execution for hundreds of years, but they relied on the strength of the axeman or of the tree branch, and by the 19th century they were replaced by more reliable inventions. The gallows dropped the condemned through a platform while being hung, and the guillotine used a sliding blade to take the head clean off the shoulders. So the task of the execution fell to someone who knew how to operate the machine. The key to the job stopped being strength and started being technical know-how. The trend sped up with the introduction of the electric chair in the late 19th century, finalized by Edwin Davis in 1890. It was adopted by New York, and Davis became the first state executioner of the state. He was responsible for performing maintenance on the chair and ensuring the proper flow of electricity went through it. Davis performed over 240 executions, making him one of the most prolific executioners in American history until his retirement in 1914. He even presided over the execution of Alon Chokos, the assassin of President William McKinley. With the introduction of lethal injection in the 20th century, the job continued to become more technical. What hasn't changed is the need for anonymity in the role of executioner. While executioners could be celebrities in the Middle Ages, it was far more common for them to avoid the notoriety of their role. It was common for executioners to wear masks to disguise their identity. With firing squads, it was often done by having a line of executioners aiming at the condemned, but all but one of them holding guns loaded with blanks. That way, no one would know who fired the fatal shots, including the executioners themselves. Some states use a private citizen as a volunteer, like in Florida, where they're paid $150 per execution and their identity is kept secret. But in most states, working as an executioner is possible job duty for a member of the correction staff. Lethal injection, done by sending a cocktail of drugs into the convict's body, first to render them unconscious and then to stop their heart, is the most common method used today. A team of medical professionals is needed to set up the drug cocktails, but the actual execution is left in the hands of the corrections officer, who turns the key to activate the flow. It's common to have 2 to 3 on hand, turning keys with only one activating the drugs. You've done a lot of research on the history of executioners, but nothing's quite prepared you for today. You're snapped out of your thoughts by the sound of your alarm clock going off. It's time to drive to work and head to the prison. Preparation has been going on for weeks, but the day of the execution is the busiest. You'll have a full day of work ahead of you, working with the prison's death team. It's odd to be driving to work as the sun sets, but there's a reason for that. You're beginning the 24-hour death watch as all essential staff prepares for the execution and security goes up to ensure things go off smoothly. Why is security so tight in the 24 hours before an execution? Prisons are worried about potential disruptions from protests outside the prison by anti-death penalty advocates, conflicts between the family of the condemned and those who have chosen to witness the execution, or even attempts to break out an inmate. For the execution of the notorious hitman Mad Dog Monroe, who is meeting with the executioner today, you'll know the prison won't be taking any chances. You'll start around 9 p.m., 24 hours before the execution is scheduled, and work closely with the death team and a specialized security team making sure the chamber is secure. But the preparations have been going on for far longer than a day. For the last 15 years, ever since Mad Dog Monroe was brought to the facility holding the death chamber, you and your team have been testing the equipment and making sure it runs properly. A botched execution is not only a massive waste of equipment and preparation, but can often result in serious medical complications for the condemned and lead to lawsuits and professional consequences for the team responsible. You've been in the death chamber so often, examining and testing the equipment for lethal injection, that it feels like second nature. But you know this time will be very different. You've had time to get to know the rest of the team, with the security often being known as the tie-down team. These correction officers have one of the most important jobs of the night. They're responsible for escorting the inmate and securing them to the gurney. While some inmates have accepted their fate and are resigned, even remorseful, others are likely to resist and may have to be physically restrained to secure the execution. From the looks you've gotten at Mad Dog Monroe during your time working on death row, you know you're not betting on him going quietly. While you meet with the warden, discuss any special concerns for the day, and do another run-through of the death chamber, you think about what the condemned is doing that day. The final day for the inmate scheduled for execution is as structured as the day for the team handling it. It differs by state, but almost all states give the condemned a few special privileges after they've been moved to the cell for those awaiting execution. This includes meeting with a member of the clergy from their faith, choosing family members they want to have at their execution, preparing their last words, and choosing their last meal. The last meal can be almost anything available, and requests have varied wildly. Some inmates have requested things as simple as a fruit salad or a single olive with the pit in it, requested by an inmate who said he hoped a tree would grow from his body. But most request a big, greasy meal of all their favorites. Fried chicken is a common choice, as is steak, lobster, ribs, and desserts like apple pie or ice cream. 49 of 50 states offer inmates their choice of a last meal. Texas stopped the tradition after one inmate, Lawrence Russell Brewer, requested a massive meal consisting of 2 chicken fried steaks, a pound of barbecue, a fully loaded pizza, and a pint of ice cream, among other things. When it was brought to him, he declined to eat any of it. The public was outraged at the waste of food, and the State Prison Bureau decided to do away with the tradition. Condemned inmates in Texas prisons now only get a standard prison meal on their last day. The execution is slated for 9 p.m. The death team comes to pick up Mad Dog Monroe about an hour before. You're part of the team, but he won't know which of his security team is going to be his executioner. From the look in his eyes, you can tell there isn't going to be any remorse or resignation there. But he doesn't put up a fight. He stares you down as he's put securely in handcuffs and leg irons and marched down the long hall to the death chamber. The team secures him to the gurney and he's strapped down using a complex system of tight straps that keep him from moving. As the lethal injection drugs have to be injected into central veins, it's critical that he not be able to move even an inch while the on-site medical team administering the syringes are working. But they won't be the ones administering the drugs, you will. While other members of the death team stay in the room, you're taken behind a panel where you're hidden from view. It's common for executioners to watch from behind a two-way mirror, where they can see the execution room but they can't be seen. The more things change, the more they stay the same. This is a higher-tech version of a masked executioner. You look down at the console in front of you, with everything you need to inject the drugs in the correct order. Being an executioner became much more complicated with the use of lethal injection. When the electric chair was the most common method of execution, it was as simple as flipping a switch to start the flow of electricity. You watch as the medical team secures the needles and checks the connection. The guests are seated, including any family members of the condemned and any people related to his victims who have asked to attend. Mad Dog Monroe is asked if he has any last words, and he speaks for a minute, but you barely hear it. Your mind is focused on the task at hand. You receive the signal from the prison warden who is presiding over the execution, and your hand moves toward the buttons on the console. With practiced ease, you press them in the correct order, and the drugs flow into the tubes in the order to put the condemned under and then to silently end his life. The process takes several minutes, and the medical professional on site checks the vitals of the condemned. He nods. The execution has gone off perfectly, and you played your part as the anonymous executioner. It's over. There's only one thing we want to tell you in this introduction, and that's the fact that you really don't want to end up on death row. After hearing these 50 facts, we guarantee you that your mind will be blown. Number 50. Okay, some hard facts first. Some of you might be wondering, what exactly is death row? Well, it's simply the name for the part of the prison where inmates await their execution. For instance, if you get sentenced to death in California, you'll go to death row units at either Corcoran State Prison or San Quentin Prison. You're thinking, tell me something I don't know. Okay, how about the fact that California leads the US in terms of how many people are on death row? The current number is 725 as of January 1st, 2020. Florida is next with 347 death row inmates, and Texas gets the bronze with 218 death row inmates. Number 49. We'll give you some more hard facts soon, but let's now add some insanity to this story. As you might guess, some death row inmates are not of a sound mind. They might not have even been declared insane in the courts, but it's very likely they were very much certifiably mad. In 2004, a man named Andre Thomas killed his estranged wife and 2 children. He used a different knife for each killing, later saying he didn't want to contaminate them with demons. He removed some of their organs and subsequently stabbed himself in the chest. He then left a voicemail message for his dead wife's parents. It went like this: "I need y'all's help. Something bad is happening to me, and it keeps happening, and I don't know what's going on. I need some help. I think I'm in hell. I need help." He turned himself in and confessed to what he'd done. While he was in jail, he had removed one of his eyes, and later 3 doctors confirmed that this guy had schizophrenia. The state didn't care, and the man stood trial and was sentenced to death. While serving time on death row, he removed another eye and proceeded to eat it. He's still waiting for his execution. Yeah, that's a crazy story, and they will get even crazier. Number 48. So which states have executed the most death row inmates since 1976? The top 3 states are Oklahoma with 112, Virginia with 1 more at 113, and Texas far away at number 1 with 566 executions. Number 47. A lot of you don't know this, but it can take a really long time to get yourself executed, often between 15 and 20 years. The average time spent on death row before execution or release, yep, a lot of guys have been innocent on death row, is 16 years. Number 46. People literally go mad waiting to be killed by the state, and this madness is actually a phenomenon with a name. It's called death row phenomenon, and we're going to talk more about it later. For now, all you need to know is that it means basically losing your mind. Number 45. Okay, so you can spend a lot of time on death row. As you'll see, more inmates on death row have been innocent than you would believe. In fact, it's mind-blowing and sad just how many folks have gotten off of death row. One man spent 39 years there, and his name was Gary Albert. He murdered 3 people and was sentenced in 1974, but like the guy we just talked about, he had a long history of severe mental illnesses, including schizophrenia. The state knew very well he was totally insane, and that's why he could never be executed. He waited 39 years and saw 75 other death row inmates in Florida leave and never come back. He died of a brain tumor in 2013. Number 44. Okay, so one more person that spent a long time on death row was a guy named Jack Alderman, and he spent 33 years fighting for his freedom. He was accused of killing his wife, although there was no forensic evidence and the story is just plain weird. He was sentenced only on the testimony of another man, a man who might have actually been the killer. The execution of Alderman has been called a gross miscarriage of justice because it is highly unlikely he killed his wife. He was offered all kinds of deals, and he wouldn't have been executed if he only said he was guilty. He refused to do this every time he was offered a plea deal and said he just couldn't admit to doing something he hadn't done. He was executed in 2008. Number 43. You don't actually have to kill someone to be convicted of murder. You can end up on death row having been convicted of murder, but you might not have been sentenced for actually killing someone. Number 42. If that's confusing to you, here's a story. One night you're hanging out in a park, but this particular night there are a couple of guys you don't know that well. All you guys get a bit drunk and then decide to go into town. Those 2 new guys get into a fight. They beat up some dude so bad he dies. You were merely there, and you didn't even throw a punch. Plus, you didn't know these guys very well. But if you're poor, have a crappy lawyer, and maybe a couple of minor crimes to your name, you might be charged with something called felony murder. If you're African American, you're even more screwed. Sadly, racial bias in the American justice system is still prevalent. Okay, the point is, you sometimes just have to be there. If you do your research, you'll find lists of people who were executed for just being there. It was the other guy that pulled the trigger or stuck in the blade, and you'll find names such as G.W. Green, Carlos Santana, Joseph Garcia, and many more. Number 41. One more thing you need to know is that you could get charged for murder if one of your friends dies. Yep, if you've heard of the Elkhart 4, you'll know that 4 kids decided to burglarize a house, and the house owner shot and killed one of those kids. The 3 other kids were charged with felony murder and were looking at 55, 50, and 55 years behind bars for something some guy did while protecting his house. They didn't end up spending any time on death row and eventually got much lower sentences, but it's a warning to you all. Number 40. A guy named Nick Yaris spent 22 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He educated himself there, and he was later released after DNA evidence proved that he did not commit the crime. Yaris sued the Delaware County District Attorney's Office, and the settlement was $3 million. You can see his story in the documentary film The Fear of 13. Number 39. What about lethal injection? What's that? It's a 3-shot cocktail. The first part is usually sodium thiopental, a super-strength barbiturate that basically knocks the person out. Then pancuronium bromide, a muscle relaxant, should make the lungs not work so well, and the third part is potassium chloride. Enough of this will affect the heart and should bring on cardiac arrest. We should also say that certain states have their own recipes. Number 38. Actually, lethal injection, while generally viewed as the most humane form of execution in modern times, has a really high botch rate at 7.1%. Yep, that's a lot of botching. And you could ask if the formidable guillotine at least caused less pain for some folks. Firing squads also had a 100% success rate. The botch rate of the electric chair is 1.9%, hanging 3.1%, and the gas chamber 5.4%. Number 37. You might now be thinking, wait a minute. In recent years, there have been bodies piling up all over the USA during what we call the opioid crisis. In 2018, there were 46,802 deaths related to opioids such as heroin and fentanyl, and the new tidal wave of prescription opioids. The numbers were similar in 2017 and 2019. So that's around 150,000 deaths, which if you've ever seen one, pretty much means going to sleep and not waking up. It seems pretty humane. Since 1999, there have been around 800,000 deaths in the USA because of drugs, and mainly the deaths were opiate-related. Although opiates might have been mixed with another drug such as benzodiazepine, there's a lethal threesome: the opioid, the benzo, and the booze. Anyway, some people have said, why not give people a strong drug like fentanyl when you want to execute them? It's obviously a formidable killer on the streets, so why not mainline murderers with it? Well, in 2018, Nebraska became the first state to use fentanyl as part of a lethal injection, and they even threw in a benzodiazepine. They knocked him out with the opioid, slowed him down with the relaxant, and for good measure, they threw in some of the heart-stopping potassium chloride. Number 36. Lethal injection often fails simply because the executioners can't find a vein. But in one occasion, they actually injected the substances into the flesh of a man and not his veins. 35 minutes later, he got another shot. That kind of time frame is what we now call cruel and unusual punishment. Others have just reacted badly to the cocktail, with their bodies going into spasms and moans coming from their mouth. Still, the real horror stories involve the gas chamber and the electric chair, and that you'll learn about later. Number 35. There might also be 2 separate cartridges during a lethal injection. The second one is a backup. Number 34. A guy named Ramel Broom actually survived his execution in 2009. Over the period of 2 hours, the executioners tried to find a vein. Ramel, reportedly sobbing at times, even helped them, but it failed. They took him off the gurney and the state was accused of cruel and unusual punishment. Ramel is still on death row today. Number 33. Okay, so this was before modern death row, but when the British first settled into the colonies, they had a list of 222 crimes that were punishable by death. If you destroyed a fish pond, you could die. Or if you messed with a rabbit warren, you could be strung up. Painting your face black at night? Also a capital crime. Yeah, that's crazy, but we have more crazy down the line. Number 32. Serial killer Philip Carl Jablonski was on San Quentin death row for many years. He was an avid letter writer and had pen pals all over the world. He would sometimes draw cartoons on the letters, but often they were quite disturbing. In fact, his letters could be pleasant in parts, and then suddenly he'd talk about really gruesome things he'd done. He actually killed his first wife, but married a female pen pal while doing time for that murder. When he got out, they could finally be together as a real married couple. He soon killed his new wife and also killed her mother. Jablonski would kill again, and he would get caught. Believe it or not, more women proposed to him when he was on death row. He recently died in his cell, so he's no longer an eligible death row bachelor. Number 31. In fact, a few people have gotten married while on death row. One of the worst serial killers of all time got married even though his hobby was brutally killing women. His name was Ted Bundy. Some women have a thing for killers. There's a term for it. It's called hybristophilia. Number 30. The death penalty was actually abolished for a while, but it came back in 1976. In the US, there are only 29 states in which you can be legally killed by the state. Number 29. Since 1976, there have been 1,512 executions in the US. Number 28. Only 15 of those executions were of women, and 22 of the executed people were juveniles. Number 27. Since the death penalty, there have been a total of 294 cases of clemency. This is when someone with power steps in and says this guy should not be killed. The president or the state governor could do this, but they will have to weigh up a lot of facts and also think about the public's reaction. This doesn't mean the person is released, or what we might call exonerated. It just means the person's death sentence has been commuted to another sentence. And yes, it sometimes happens like it does in the movies. That is, it can happen just hours before the execution is due to be carried out. In 2020, a guy named Jimmy Meters was given clemency just a few hours before he was about to get a lethal injection. His sentence was reduced to life without possibility of parole. Meters was accused of killing a store clerk, but he says another guy did it. He's even tried to get DNA evidence to support this, but that hasn't been possible yet. He claims he's innocent. He had no criminal history before the event and has had a spotless prison record, which was all taken into consideration when he was granted clemency. We'll soon tell you shocking facts about innocent people on death row, but we think you need to hear other facts first. Number 26. One Republican governor shocked the world in the early 2000s. His name was George Ryan, and he said in 2003, "Okay, enough's enough. Something stinks here," and he pardoned every death row prisoner. Yep, all 163 men and 4 women who'd already served collectively over 2,000 years were taken off a death row. Why would he do such a thing, you might be wondering? Okay, let's just give you his statement. It's best you hear it from him. The facts I've seen in reviewing each and every one of these cases raised questions not only about the innocence of people on death row, but about the fairness of the death penalty system as a whole. Our capital system is haunted by the demon of error in determining guilt and error in determining who among the guilty deserves to die. A lot of people were upset, and not only die-hard fans of legalized killing, some of the families of the victims were annoyed and upset. The thing is, were they gunning for the right man to die? Mr. Ryan made his decision after seeing that his state had executed 12 people but had exonerated 13 innocent men who had been wrongly convicted. Number 25. If you actually look at pardons given all over the US, you'll see that they're not given that often. In fact, Illinois leads the way with 187 pardons, and in second place is Ohio with 21. The majority of states just have 1, 2, or 3 pardons. Number 24. Has a pardon ever happened like in the movies when the minute hand is on the screen and the prisoner gets saved at the very last minute? The answer is yes. It happened in 2018 to a guy named Thomas Bart Whitaker. Bart was only in his early 20s when he decided to kill his whole family and claim the inheritance money. The family was quite wealthy, we should say. The son got his roommate to kill his mother and brother, but his father survived being shot. It was the father years later who would protest the governor and get his son off a death row. The two had become good friends. The father said his son was the last of his family, so to kill him would be to leave him with no one. It seems the governor couldn't ignore that plea. Number 23. In the past, when a prisoner was being marched to the death chamber, the guards would shout, "Dead man walking." People on death row have said when someone goes, it's always a very depressing day. Number 22. Death row in some prisons has been criticized for its conditions, in some places so much so that the prison has been forced to close the wing down and build a new one. Death row inmates are usually locked down in solitary for 23 hours a day. They'll sit in that windowless cell for many years, and unlike other prisoners or murderers, they don't generally get to mix in with people in the yard or have prison jobs. This drives them absolutely crazy. The American Civil Liberties Union actually sued the state of Oklahoma and won. It said solitary confinement could only be described as being buried alive. It said the men get 3 showers a week and 5 times a week can leave their cell for an hour, but they never get to see the sun or the sky, since their exercise time is just in another concrete box, a bigger concrete box. But every prison is not the same, and we saw some prisons where death row inmates could work and communicate with other prisoners. We should say that in some cases this had come after lawsuits. Number 21. These conditions can and have led to something called death row syndrome. This might mean men wanting to take their own lives, but even that's not easy in solitary confinement. Some men literally lose their minds. They become mentally ill on death row and might start having visual and auditory hallucinations. Some men just waver their appeals and plead for the end to come sooner. 16 years on death row in these conditions can be hard. In fact, because of such brutal conditions, other countries such as the UK and Canada have refused to extradite people to the US. They say no human should be kept in those conditions since it breaches standards of human rights. It's not about the death penalty, but what comes before it. You've all lived in self-isolation at home for a while. Now imagine your house was one small cell and 4 cement walls. Imagine no one could talk to you except when someone handed you food or took you to another cement room for an hour a day. Now imagine this went on for years and at the end, you get to die. Do you think you'd get death row syndrome? Number 20. It seems not all death rows are the same though, because we found a recent story that told us at San Quentin one death row inmate killed another death row inmate while the two were out in the yard. This is actually very unusual, and San Quentin officials said it was the first time it had happened since 1996. Death row inmates are separated from the rest of the prison, but they do get to go out in the yard together. Death rows all over the US don't usually see much violence. They are, for the most part, eerily quiet places. Number 19. Scientists in the US and almost anywhere in the world say the death penalty does not deter killers. In fact, there are lower murder rates in the US states that don't have the death penalty. There are some experts that think the death penalty does deter serious crimes, but they're in the minority. The split is around 90% that don't think it works and 10% that think it works. Number 18. The USA lies around 7th place in regard to most executions per year. China leads, although it doesn't report its executions. North Korea could also be a very high number, but again, the country won't report the numbers. Other big fans of executions are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Somalia, and so the US is in pretty bad company when it comes to human rights records. Number 17. The first prison escape from death row was in 1934, and the man who got away was the gangster Raymond Hamilton. The infamous Bonnie and Clyde helped him get out. The next death row escape wouldn't be until 1984, when the infamous Briley brothers did something even more over the top than a Hollywood movie. They basically took over the death row unit, stole the guards' uniforms, put on riot gear, put a TV on the stretcher, and walked it out of the prison while saying it was a bomb. They then drove off into the night laughing like hyenas while smoking their stash of weed. Number 16. A man named Martin Garul also escaped, and he basically scaled fences and ran for his life while the guards were shooting at him. He didn't get that far though, since his body was found in a river not long after. One of those shots had hit him in the back. The year was 1998. Number 15. Hangings used to be public events, and they were very popular with some people who treated them like a family day out. The father would read the newspaper and look up gleefully. "Wow, honey, grab your jacket. There's a hanging on today." 1936 was the year of the last public hanging in the US, and up to 20,000 people turned up to the event in Kentucky. Did that criminal spend 20 years on death row? Nope, he committed the crime in June and was hanged in August. Things were a bit different back then. Number 14. The records show that death row and the death penalty is way more expensive for the taxpayer. One study in Maryland revealed that the average cost for each case was $3 million. Another study showed Louisiana spent $15.6 million per year on its capital punishment system. Yet another study in 2018 showed that in all states with the death penalty, the additional cost per year was almost $3 billion, compared to if death row criminals had just been given a life sentence without parole. That's why some people argue for the abolition of the death penalty, not because of moral concerns, but because it costs too much. Number 13. A Gallup poll in 2019 revealed that 60% of Americans supported life imprisonment without the possibility of parole over the death penalty. In 1986, it was just 34% of Americans that held the view. Number 12. There was once a woman named Kelly Gissendaner, and in 2015, when she became the last woman in the United States to be executed, for now at least, she was the only woman on death row in Georgia. Her crime was killing her husband, and she didn't deny doing it. On death row, she converted to Christianity and created the group Struggle Sisters as a way to help women get through their time. Gissendaner might have had more freedom than some people on death row. She sang the song Amazing Grace before she was given her cocktail of drugs. Number 11. That cocktail of drugs costs only around $100. The killing part is not the most expensive part. That is the imprisonment part and the mind-boggling legal costs. Number 10. Sometimes prisoners order rather strange meals for the meal they have before they get executed, but in terms of statistics, a cheeseburger and fries is the most popular meal. Number 9. In 2012, when a man named Gary Simmons was asked for his last meal, he might have been trying to die by way of heart attack. That's because his last meal contained 29,000 calories. We're not going to mention all the items because they're just too many. Let's just say it included a lot of junk food, a ton of dips, chips, fries, and cheeses, and a bucket of Coke. Number 8. A man named David Matthews spent 17 years on death row in Oklahoma and tried a few times to prove his innocence. Before he was given the lethal injection, he joked, "I think that the governor's phone's broke. He hasn't called yet." Number 7. Around 90% of people on death row could not afford their own lawyer and so had to be given a free one by the state. Number 6. Legal experts and statisticians who did some investigating believe that from 1976 to 2004, 4.1% of those who were given the death penalty were actually innocent. That is 340 prisoners they believed were innocent or are innocent. The writers of the report said there is little doubt that innocent men have been executed. If you watch true crime shows, you'll know why so many people might have died innocent men. It's usually shoddy police work and lack of evidence. That and the fact some evidence that supports the innocent is sometimes purposely suppressed, or forensic evidence has been tampered with. Number 5. In 2019, 2 men named Clifford Williams Jr. and Nathan Myers were released from prison after they'd both been given death sentences. They'd served 43 years behind bars. One of the guys went in age 18 and came out aged 61. The other went in 33 and came out 76. These guys were not released because of DNA evidence. It was discovered that there was very little evidence to prove they did the crime, and they actually had witnesses saying they were with the guys when the murder was committed. This is why money matters. This wouldn't have happened if they'd had a good lawyer. Number 4. There have been 167 exonerations of prisoners on death row in the U.S. since 1973. DNA testing helped get some of the men off of death row when that started being used, while some people convicted from hair tests have been given new trials since hair comparisons used back before DNA testing were not reliable. Number 3. In 2019, there were another 2 death row exonerations. One was Paul Browning, and he had served 33 years on death row in Nevada's Ely State Prison. His case went back to court, and that court said there had been disturbing prosecutorial misconduct and woefully inadequate assistance of counsel during that guy's first trial for murder. After 33 years, he walked free, and he told the press, "I just want to find a little bit of peace after coming through all this madness." 33 years of madness is a lot to take in. Charles Ray Finch was also exonerated from death row that year and was pushed out of prison in a wheelchair at the age of 81. He'd spent 43 years on death row as an innocent man. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit said the evidence against him was woeful, and police had apparently pressured people to testify against him. They also created a very sketchy lineup not remotely related to anything you could call justice. Official misconduct and getting people to tell lies in court, or people lying on their own behalf, is a reason for a lot of exonerations. Number 2. Okay, so what about an innocent man who did get executed? This story is nothing short of insane. In 1976, 2 police officers were shot when checking on a parked car. Inside was a driver and a man named Jesse Tefero. His wife and children were sleeping in the back seat. Tefero was sentenced to death, as was his wife. The kids went on to live with the wife's parents, but both were placed into care when those grandparents died in a plane crash. Tefero was executed in the electric chair in 1990. Old Sparky didn't work well though, and it took 7 minutes for the man to die. Prior to that, his head set on fire, and it wasn't a good scene. It later turned out that the driver did the shooting, and he even admitted to it. The evidence pointed to the driver doing it too. Tefero's wife was at least later released, but only after she'd served 16 years as an innocent woman. She actually ended up marrying a guy who'd also been exonerated after being convicted of murder. Number 1. Most states have compensation measures when people are wrongfully convicted and later exonerated, but not all states. 33 states right now have compensation laws for exonerees, from normal prison or death row. How much a person gets can vastly differ. In Louisiana, a person can get $250,000, but that must be paid out over a period of 10 years. In California, the maximum is $140 per day for every day wrongfully served. So for 43 years, you'd get over $2 million. Wisconsin only gives $5,000 per year wrongly imprisoned, and this is about as good as a kick in the face. It also caps the amount at $25,000. Texas is pretty good. It gives $80,000 per wrongfully imprisoned year and also helps with other matters such as child support and legal fees and getting you back on your feet and fitting into society. A civil rights violation lawsuit can also be filed, especially if there was official misconduct by the state, and that might add up to millions if the exoneree wins the case. Then you have states such as Iowa and Oklahoma, where if you pled guilty, you'll get nothing. Yep, some innocent men on death row have pled guilty before. In normal prison, lots of innocent men take plea deals. In Florida, you won't get compensated one dime if you had any other crime on your record. It also can take years to get any compensation. One guy who did 20 years as an innocent man got a check for $25,000, but that was 4.5 years after his release. Some guys in some states end up with nothing but a "goodbye, sorry we messed up." It all depends on the case and the state. A man in California spent 39 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, and he sued the authorities. He got $21 million. He also got $1.95 million for the $140 a day the state awards those who have been wrongfully incarcerated. It's quiet on death row. Everyone knows that in the next 60 minutes, one of their fellow prisoners will no longer be alive. The echoing of a guard's boots is heard coming down the cell block. They stop in front of the unlucky prisoner's cell. He has only 1 hour left before a deadly cocktail is shot into his body. There's a quiet sob as this terrible reality sets in. 60 minutes before execution. The prisoner takes a deep breath and looks out the bars at the two men standing with their backs to him. They've been placed there to ensure that he doesn't do anything to harm himself before his final sentence can be carried out. The prisoner walks up to the bars, grabs them with both hands, and closes his eyes. He will not beg for mercy. He has accepted his fate. 59 minutes before execution. The prisoner walks back to his cot and picks up the freshly washed jumpsuit, which is folded on his bed. After taking a final shower, the guards brought him a new uniform to put on before the execution. It's no different than what he's wearing, but it's clean. The prisoner changes his outfit. He feels a calmness wash over his body. Only a few hours ago, he was eating his last meal. It was nothing fancy, just a pizza and some soda. There's a budget for how much can be spent on a final meal, but this was all he wanted anyway. 58 minutes before execution. He sits on his bed. Although he is calm, the prisoner is also restless. Less than an hour from now, he'll be dead. He thinks about what'll be waiting for him on the other side. He's done some terrible things in his life, and for the last decade, he has been repenting for those sins. He wonders if it'll be enough, or if an unforgiving God waits for him in the afterlife. Either way, he does not have much hope of going to heaven. All he can do is pray that there's a way to change his fate once he leaves the mortal realm. 55 minutes before execution. The prisoner stands up again and goes back over to the cold metal bars that separate him from the guards. "Thank you for treating me like a human and keeping everyone in this facility safe," he says to them. The guards do not respond. They remain silent but give the prisoner a nod. They are not friends, and the guards do not pity the man, but his acknowledgement is appreciated. 50 minutes before execution. A door creaks open at the end of the hallway. Two men approach the cell. They're warden and the chaplain. One of the guards opens the cell door. Both the warden and the chaplain enter the small room. 3 chairs are brought in, and the prisoner along with his 2 guests sit down for a final conversation. 45 minutes before execution. After prayers are said, the 3 men get down to business. The warden explains exactly what's about to happen, so the prisoner can prepare himself. He'll be led to the execution chamber where he'll be allowed to make a last statement. The prisoner already had something in mind, but now he's going over it in his head to make sure his last words come out just right. 40 minutes before execution. The warden leaves to oversee the final preparations for the execution. The chaplain stays to recite prayers and answer questions the prisoner might have. "What do you think it'll be like after I die?" he asks. The chaplain looks at him for a moment. "God works in mysterious ways," he responds. "I do not know what comes after this life, but if you put your faith in God, all will be as He ordains." The prisoner ponders this for a moment. His life is no longer in his hands. He bows his head and continues to pray. 30 minutes before execution. As the chaplain and prisoner talk, the execution chamber is being prepared for his arrival. The executioner takes out a series of vials from cold storage and lines them up on a tray. They check the needles and tubes to make sure the lethal injection goes according to plan. The heart monitor gets turned on to make sure it's working properly. Satisfied that the execution will go smoothly, they leave the room to inform the warden everything is set. Then the executioner goes back into his office to prepare himself mentally and change into their scrubs. 20 minutes before execution. The warden returns to the cell where the chaplain and the prisoner are praying. "It's time," he tells them. The chaplain puts his hand on the prisoner's shoulder and then stands up. He leaves the cell. The guards step to the door and wait for the prisoner. He takes a deep breath and rises from his chair. They place him in handcuffs and escort him out of the cell and down the hall. They stop at a series of doors that buzz as they unlock. Once they're through, the doors automatically swing shut and lock behind them. There's no turning back now. 15 minutes before execution. The curtain is drawn back from the window separating the viewing room from the execution chamber. A door at the far side of the room opens. The warden, along with the prisoner's mother, a lawyer, and a state witness enter the room. They sit in the metal folding chairs in front of the viewing window. The mother of the man being executed holds a wad of crumpled tissue paper in her hand. She does not approve of what her son did, but he is still her own flesh and blood. She will see this through even though it'll be incredibly difficult for her. 10 minutes before execution. The buzzer on the door leading to the execution chamber sounds. The metal slab swings open. The prisoner's led into the room by the guards. He still wears handcuffs as he's brought to the window. He raises his head and looks his mother in the eyes for the last time. He nods to his lawyer and then closes his eyes. He recites his last statement from memory. It's mostly composed of words asking for forgiveness for what he's done. He accepts his fate but wants the people present to know that he feels remorse. If he could do it all over again, he would have never committed his crimes. He does not plead for second chances. 7 minutes before execution. The prisoner is brought over to the metal table in the middle of the room and lays down. The guards remove his handcuffs. The prisoner is secured using leather restraints. They're pulled tight so his arms and legs cannot move from the table. The guards check the restraints one final time before stepping to the side. 5 minutes before execution. The executioner sterilizes the needles and swabs iodine onto the prisoner's arms. These procedures seem unnecessary since preventing infection is a moot point at this stage, but it's done anyway. They insert an IV into each of the prisoner's arms. One will be used as the main delivery method for the drugs that will kill him. The other is a backup in case something goes wrong. After the IVs are secured, the chaplain says a prayer and a few words. He looks at the prisoner on the table and grabs his hand briefly. "God will be waiting for you on the other side," he whispers. The chaplain lets go and moves to the corner of the room. He's employed by the prison system, otherwise he would have been required to be in the observation room with everyone else. 3 minutes before execution. The executioner moves to the side of the table and checks the needles in each arm. The people in the viewing room look on. The first plunger is inserted into the IV, and the drugs are pushed into his veins. The first shot is composed of sodium thiopental or pentobarbital. Both of these drugs are fast-working anesthetics that render the prisoner unconscious in less than 30 seconds. As time goes by, his vision becomes blurry. He drifts in and out of consciousness, and he's in a dreamlike state. It's then that the next part of the procedure can begin. 2 minutes before execution. The executioner inserts another needle into the IV and pushes the plunger. Pancuronium bromide enters the unconscious prisoner's system, causing their muscles to relax and leading to the paralysis of the entire body. This includes the diaphragm and respiratory muscles. After the pancuronium bromide is administered, the prisoner would eventually die from asphyxiation. But there is one more drug added to the cocktail inside their body to ensure death is swift. 90 seconds before execution. The executioner inserts the final drug into the IV. Potassium chloride is injected into the prisoner's body. This increase in potassium salt in his system causes the heart to beat irregularly and eventually leads to cardiac arrest. 1 second before execution. The lethal cocktail circulating through the unconscious prisoner's body does exactly what it's intended to do. His heart has stopped beating, his lungs have stopped taking in oxygen, and his brain is shutting down. The EKG hooked up to his chest does not pulse any longer, but is droning a single long beep. The prisoner is dead. The executioner manually checks his pulse and the body. They confirm that the prisoner has passed away and turn off the machines in the room. After the execution, the chaplain bows his head and says a final prayer. The people in the viewing room stand up and are ushered out of the room by the warden. The executioner drapes a white sheet over the deceased prisoner. The execution has been carried out. His final hour on death row is over. In the coming days, his body will be cremated and returned to his family.
What's worse, being a man on death row or being a woman on death row? The horrors that await anyone sentenced to death in the United States are claimed by human rights organizations to be a form of torture. You may never have thought about what death row is like for women, but after this video, you'll never forget these terrible facts. One of the most horrible things to think about, and the biggest difference between males and females on death row, is that a man will never be pregnant while awaiting his execution. This is not always true for women. Let that sink in for a moment. Imagine carrying an innocent life inside you while waiting for your own execution. It's a truly awful thought. So, what would happen in this situation? Practically every country has agreed that a pregnant woman cannot be executed until after the baby is born. This makes sense, but it also means that the situation has occurred before. For example, one death row inmate in India was pregnant when she was arrested and sentenced. She gave birth in prison and her son stayed with her for 6 years. When the sentence was finally slated to be carried out, the boy was taken away by the state and given to a foster family. There have also been cases of children living with their mothers on death row in Pakistan and Uganda, so this wasn't an isolated event. This is a rare but absolutely insane situation to be in. Needless to say, a male death row inmate would never have to deal with being pregnant or raising a child while he awaited his execution. We're now going to focus on death row inmates in the US and how the experience differs between males and females. Death row may be different between states and on a case-by-case basis. However, the experience for females on death row can be vastly different than those of males. This is slightly surprising because on paper, it seems that what both sexes go through are relatively the same. But in reality, this is far from the truth. We don't often think about women who are on death row, and that's for a good reason.
On average, around 12% of all murders in the United States are committed by females, and since murder in conjunction with other offenses is normally what gets someone the death penalty, there are just not as many females on death row as males. However, there also may be another reason for this, which you may find appalling. Although women account for around 10% of murders in the US, they only make up around 2% of the inmates on death row. On top of that, even fewer than those 2% actually get executed. Most end up in solitary confinement for the duration of their lives or their sentences modified. This is where one of the big differences between death row for males and death row for females occurs. Even before women are sentenced to death, the process could be skewed slightly in their favor. There are two reasons for this, and we'll let you judge if they're fair or not. The first reason why the death penalty is not as common for female murderers as males is because of the nature of the crimes that women commit. The death penalty is normally reserved for killers who also committed other crimes on top of murder, such as large-scale drug trafficking. Normally, in cases where women commit murders, it's their first and only offense. This obviously does not make murder right. However, like with many male murders, if it's the woman's first and only crime, they normally aren't sentenced to death. Capital punishment is typically reserved for serial killers or sociopaths who murder or harm many victims. In the case of most females, the murder is the only crime committed. Again, we're not saying that one murder shouldn't constitute punishment, but for both males and females, it's less likely for someone to receive the death penalty for a single murder. Therefore, the prosecutors who try to convict a female murderer with a single victim don't have a strong case for seeking the death penalty. The other reason why women are sent to death row less often than males has more to do with culture and society than anything else. Whether you believe women and men are equals in every way, or that there are certain inherent differences between the two sexes, can be a hotly debated topic. Studies found that juries tend to hold the perception that women are more fragile than men and that they have more redeeming qualities. We're not saying this is necessarily true, just that the average jury feels this way. Therefore, a jury is less likely to sentence a woman to death than a man. Defense lawyers claim that it's almost always easier to convince a jury that a female defendant suffered emotional distress that led them to commit the crime than it is to convince a jury of the same thing for a male defendant. This can allow defense attorneys to seek more lenient sentences for females and oftentimes be more successful. This is just the reality of the system we have, and one major difference of how males get to death row versus females. So currently, how do the two sexes stack up against one another in terms of numbers on death row? Unsurprisingly, there are many more men on death row than females. As of October 2020, the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund published a report stating there were 51 women on death row in the United States. During that same time, there were approximately 2,500 men on death row. And since 1976, when the death penalty was reinstated in the United States, approximately 1.2% of total executions have been females. Once put on death row, things become extremely difficult for both male and female inmates. They're put into solitary confinement, which human rights organizations have classified as a form of torture. They then have to await their execution date. However, the situation for female death row prisoners can be much worse, especially when things go very wrong. A study conducted by the ACLU found that 1 in 5 women on death row said they were assaulted or harassed while in prison. It probably comes as no surprise that most prison guards are males. This means certain situations can become incredibly uncomfortable for women who need to carry out their daily business. A third of the women surveyed report that the corrections officers watched them while they showered or used the toilet. If this was absolutely necessary, which it was not, there were other ways to make sure a prisoner was observed. Males most likely run into similar problems, but the data collected found that 75% of all reported assaults in U.S. prisons come from females. This suggests that the experience on death row, or just prison in general for females, differs greatly than for males. It's interesting to note that although female death row inmates are in solitary confinement like their male counterparts, they know they're being observed. This is most likely a systemic problem and one that human rights organizations have voiced concerns over. Female inmates also tend to be on death row for longer than males. Although you might think this is a good thing, that's not necessarily the case. For both males and females, isolation takes a toll on the mental state of the individual. This is one of the reasons that solitary confinement is seen as inhumane. Since women stay on death row longer, the strain on their mental health becomes greater and greater, meaning female death row inmates are under torturous conditions longer than males. And since the prison system is made up predominantly of men, the cells for death row tend to be designed for the male sex. Biologically, males and females are different. Along with the capacity to become pregnant, women also have to contend with a monthly menstrual cycle. Facilities who are not prepared can find themselves lacking the supplies that female death row inmates need. You can debate whether certain rights should be taken away from inmates, but it's hard to make a case to withhold necessary resources for the biological process of a prisoner, regardless of if they're male or female. At this point, we'd like to mention that things can get a little tricky. It's only until relatively recently that studies have been published about female death row inmates. Our lack of public knowledge is just another difference between males and females on death row. Many studies of death row prisoners lump both sexes together, and there are most certainly many similarities between the experiences of males and females on death row in the US. One notable statistic is that over the last 40 years, the time spent on death row has increased. This has raised the alarm on the long-term effects of solitary confinement. However, female death row inmates have been undergoing longer times in solitary than males for many years. The average time spent on death row right now is about 20 years. That's a long time for anyone to be in solitary confinement, as we're finding out from numerous human rights studies. But we often forget, or didn't even know, that this was always the norm for female death row inmates in the United States. It's claimed that the reason the length of stay on death row has increased over the years is to allow the defense more time to gather evidence and exonerate their client. The worst thing that could possibly happen is that someone who is innocent is put to death. Yet, innocent people have been wrongfully executed by the judicial system before, and we're still finding people locked up on death row who were wrongfully convicted. Whether slowly losing your mind on death row or being executed as an innocent person is worse, the fact remains time spent on death row for everyone is getting longer, but for women it has been and still is longer than men. So, who has it worse on death row? Men or women? It's not pleasant for either of the sexes, but we assume these people are people who have done terrible things. It can be argued that women who are sentenced to death have unique hurdles that they have to deal with while incarcerated. What may be the scariest difference of all between male and female death row is how little we know about the female experience. The studies that lump males and females together tend to only show the male side of things, because their numbers make up most of the system. It's a nerve-wracking thought that we really don't know all the differences between male and female death row. What is slowly coming to light is that female inmates may experience even more trauma on death row than males. So we have to ask ourselves, how broken is our capital punishment system? You enter your death row cell at the young age of 25. The door slams behind you, and for the next few months you hope in vain that somebody will realize what a terrible injustice has happened. Perhaps a new witness will come forward, you think, or video evidence will conclusively prove that you are an innocent man. But that doesn't happen, and slowly but surely over the years you start to lose your mind, locked down in that cell most of the day. Your friends, your family, well, you think they believe you, but you know that some have their doubts. Since you were accused of killing a child, the prison code means you got a kill on sight label attached to you. One day that almost happens, and you have to spend a few weeks in the infirmary. Finally, after 19 years and with the help of some compassionate lawyers, you win an appeal. It turned out the cops were corrupt and you were badly represented in your initial trial. 19 years, the madness, the beating, the loss of a real life. Surely you deserve to be compensated. Well, that's another battle you'll have to fight, just like our subjects in this video. Anthony Ray Hinton. On February 25, 1985, a fast food manager was shot and killed in the state of Alabama. On July 2nd of that year, another fast food manager was shot and killed in a similar armed robbery not far away. In yet another armed robbery, a person was shot but survived the ordeal. Police thought all the robberies had been committed by the same person, and so they asked the survivor to take a look at some mugshots. That person picked out Anthony Ray Hinton, a 29-year-old man that worked at the supermarket warehouse and lived with his mother. The cops dragged him in for questioning, and like any American citizen, he was given free legal counsel if he couldn't provide his own. Except that lawyer was hardly a suitable defense for the young man, once telling him, "All y'all blacks always say you didn't do something." Police found a revolver at Hinton's mother's house, a gun they believed could have been used in the three crimes. Hinton managed to hire a ballistics expert with the little money he could raise, but the problem was that the expert was hardly trained at all. He failed miserably defending Hinton in court. Had he been a real expert, Hinton would have very likely not have done any time. The gun was all the prosecutor needed. There were no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. Hinton was sentenced to death. In 1988, he appealed, but the conviction was affirmed. A year later, the Supreme Court of Alabama affirmed his conviction again. 3 years passed, with Hinton spending most of his time in his cell. Death row is solitary confinement for most of the day, with just an hour a day that prisoners can spend outside their cells. To pass the time, he read, and he read voraciously. Something he didn't know back then was that this would have a huge impact on his life. Reading and the book club he created helped somewhat, as did his regular visits from his mother and best friend. Unfortunately, his mother died in 2002 while Hinton was still behind bars. He hoped that an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative might help him gain his freedom. The nonprofit worked on his case for many years, but no matter how many forensic experts came forward to say that the gun and the bullets didn't match, the state of Alabama refused to overturn the conviction or at least allow him to go to trial again. Finally, in 2014, when Hinton was now a middle-aged man, the Supreme Court of the United States said that Hinton's original counsel had been constitutionally deficient. It turned out that the ballistics expert his lawyer had hired wasn't even a ballistics expert. He didn't even have both of his eyes. In this new trial, the prosecution admitted that the bullets that had been fired had not come from Hinton's mother's gun. The Jefferson County Circuit Judge overturned his conviction, and the state dropped all charges. Hinton's lawyer said race, poverty, inadequate legal assistance, and prosecutorial indifference to innocence conspired to create a textbook example of injustice. Hinton said, "Everybody that played a part in sending me to death row, you will answer to God." 28 years. What do you get for 28 years of wrongful imprisonment? What do you receive for being woefully represented? Well, the state said that he did not prove his innocence and added that he didn't deserve any compensation. To this day, he has received nothing. To make matters worse, the state of Alabama recently passed legislation making it harder to get adequate counsel. It's called the Fair Justice Act, but don't let that fool you. According to the Equal Justice Initiative, it's more like the Orwellian doublespeak. In fact, Hinton has said if it was enacted while he was incarcerated, he would have been executed. If there can be any good news, it's that Hinton has written a highly praised memoir called The Sun Does Shine: How I Found Life and Freedom on Death Row. He also was awarded a Doctorate of Humane Letters degree. According to the Innocence Project, 17 states refused to compensate the innocent. Why? Well, we have no idea. Alabama isn't one of them, by the way, but the state still refused to compensate Mr. Hinton. Now for our next case, something equally as surprising. Kennedy Brewer. The date was May 3rd, 1992, and in the early hours of the morning, a 3-year-old girl was abducted from her home. What happened to her was brutal, and we won't go into details. She did not survive. The girl, Christine Jackson, was the daughter of Gloria Jackson. Gloria was the partner of 21-year-old Kennedy Brewer. He'd been babysitting the child that night along with 2 other kids that were biological children he'd had with Gloria. Since there was no forced entry to the house, police believed that Brewer was a suspect. This was despite the fact that one of the windows to the house was broken. It wasn't until 3 years after Brewer's initial arrest that the case went to court. There, it was revealed that the bodily fluids taken from the victim's body could not sufficiently be DNA tested, but it was also revealed that there were bite marks on the body. Where did they come from? Well, the defense argued that since the body was found in a creek, they were very likely the bites of some kind of insects. The prosecution disagreed, with a forensic odontologist stating that the marks had definitely come from Brewer. It should be said at the time of the trial that the bite mark expert was suspended from the American Board of Forensic Odontology. It should also be said that bite mark testimony is very controversial and has been proven to be unreliable in a slew of cases. On March 24, 1995, Brewer was sentenced to death. He always maintained his innocence, but the years passed and not much happened. Then in 2001, up-to-date DNA testing showed that the semen taken from the victim's body did not belong to Brewer. So you'd think that was enough for a quick retrial, but as you likely know, the cogs of the American justice system grind at a very slow rate. It wasn't until 2007 that Brewer was released from prison, but we should say that he was only on bail. The prosecution wanted to retry Brewer. And then what happened, you might wonder? The answer is the DNA was tested again and it matched an original suspect in the initial investigation named Justin Albert Johnson. Johnson soon admitted to Christine Jackson's murder, but get this, he also admitted to a very similar murder that had happened in the nearby area. In that case, again, there were bite marks on the victim, and yet again, the same forensic odontologist stood up in court and said they matched a man. This time, a guy named Levon Brooks. Even worse, Johnson was the only man out of those 3 who had a history of violence matching the crimes. In 2008, both Brewer and Brooks were released. The former had spent 18 years in prison and the latter 15 years. Brooks died in 2018. In this case, the state of Mississippi paid Brewer $500,000 in compensation, but the sum was paid at $50,000 a year. The money ran out, so Brewer tried getting factory jobs and he also earned money by mowing lawns and working on a fish farm. Brewer said it's very hard to find meaningful employment after being locked up for something you didn't do. In 2020, Brewer had a stroke not long after his mother died. A fundraising page was set up to help him pay for the medical bills. Okay, now for something a bit different. Richard Phillips. This man spent 45 years behind bars and he was innocent all the time. We are cheating a bit here because he wasn't handed the death sentence, but he was given life without the possibility of parole. The reason we want to tell you this story is because 45 years is the record in the US for the most time spent in prison as an innocent man. In 1972, the 26-year-old Phillips was handed his sentence for a murder in Detroit, a crime he said he didn't commit. For many years, he tried to get the sentence overturned, but on every occasion he failed. Then in 2010, his co-defendant in the case, one Richard Palumbo, told a parole board that Phillips had not committed the crime. He said another man had done it, a man named Fred Mitchell. Palumbo had said nothing at the time out of fear, but as the years passed in prison, he was consumed by guilt. As his health got worse, he feared what he might meet on the other side after having allowed an innocent man to spend so long in prison. We should also say that Fred Mitchell scared Palumbo and said that if he speaks up, his family would die. But when Palumbo heard that Mitchell was dead, he had nothing to fear. The case went back to court, and there Palumbo told the truth. But all the prosecution could offer Phillips was this: say you did it and you'll get out because of the time you served. Phillips' response was, "I'd rather die in prison than admit to something I didn't do." Age 71 in 2018, Phillips got out an innocent man, but a man that knew no one on the outside and really didn't know how things worked in modern life. He said he was overjoyed but also very scared when entering this new world. A world with computer technology, with strange cars and weird-looking gadgets. He looks well now and is getting used to his new life. For his 46 years of wrongful imprisonment, he was compensated $1.5 million. Withholding evidence. How much does a person get paid if the authorities have deliberately withheld evidence and they are found out? Let's look at a case that involved a man named Nathan Fields. In 1984, this man was accused of killing 2 people in what was said to be a gang-related crime. Fields was innocent, and the police knew that, because it was later discovered that detectives had hidden the evidence in a locker that proved Fields didn't do it. A judge was also involved in the corruption and had taken a bribe. That's how Fields got a retrial and how the new evidence came to light. He spent 18 years in prison, with 11 of them being on death row. In 2016, a judge ruled that police had hidden evidence and they had also falsified incriminating evidence. Fields was awarded $22 million. The tragedy is, in the last reports we can find about Fields, he said he had not yet received a dime of the money. The 65-year-old man says he now devotes his life to helping death row survivors. The next man is John Thompson. In 1985 in New Orleans, Thompson was sentenced to 49 years in prison for an armed robbery and also given the death sentence for a murder at a hotel. He was innocent of both crimes. What is criminally frightening about the case is the fact that just 30 days before he was going to be executed, evidence that had been hidden for 15 years by the Orleans Parish District Attorney's Office was discovered by a private investigator. That evidence proved without a doubt that Thompson was innocent of the robbery, but the robbery was connected to the murder conviction, so a judge ruled that Thompson should be exonerated. He was 40 years old. He sued for the crime that had been committed against him, and although he was awarded $14 million, a Supreme Court later overturned that decision. This happened even though it was discovered that the district attorney at the time of Thompson's conviction had suppressed exculpatory evidence in 9 out of 36 death penalty convictions. No one has ever been held accountable. Thompson later created a nonprofit called Resurrection After Exoneration, an organization to help reconnect exonerees to their communities. He died in 2017, aged 55. A few years before his death, he wrote, "I don't care about the money. I just want to know why the prosecutors who hid the evidence, sent me to prison for something I didn't do, and nearly had me killed are not in jail themselves." A 23-year-old man sits in a prison cell with the widest smile painted across his face. Clasped in his right hand is a toy train. He pushes it right up to his eyes, saying hi to the little people he imagines are in the carriages. He winds it up and sets it off down the landing, giggling with excitement as he does so. A few seconds later, another prisoner sends the train back to his cell. It's hard to believe he's about to face the gas chamber. It's even harder to believe he's been convicted of an extremely grisly axe murder. He might be guilty as charged, but he's liked by all the guards and the warden. That warden, in fact, calls him the happiest prisoner on death row. This is the story of a man named Joe Arity. He was born in 1915 in Pueblo, Colorado, to parents Henry and Mary. Both were immigrants from Syria who'd gone to the USA to make a better life for themselves. It was tough at first, but Henry's job at a steel mill afforded the family certain luxuries they hadn't had before. There was a problem, though, with their young son. They knew very well that Joe wasn't like a lot of the other kids, a conviction which was substantiated when his elementary school principal one day approached Henry and Mary and told them that Joe wasn't able to learn with the other kids. He could barely string a sentence together, never mind wrestle with difficult spelling or arithmetic. His parents thought the best thing for Joe was to send him to a school that could better deal with his learning difficulties, so off he was packed to the State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives. Only this place was not salubrious in the least for young Joe. Being short and having prominent ears, Joe was the target of bullying from other kids in the home. He suffered beatings at the bullies' hands, just as he did when he returned to his neighborhood. Even the adults were unkind, some of them laughing when slow Joe walked down the street. Such were the times. When he was 21, he just picked up and left, jumping on a freight rail car, not knowing where it would take him. He ended up in the rail yards of Cheyenne in the state of Wyoming, wandering around, trying his best to find food and shelter. That's when the cops picked him up and his life went from bad to worse. Those cops had been looking for someone, a man, presumably, who'd committed horrendous crimes about 200 miles away in Pueblo, Colorado. They found out soon that Joe came from Pueblo, and what's more, a rail car ran from there to Cheyenne. That was enough to put Joe in handcuffs. The crimes had indeed been extreme, and certainly enough for the public to put pressure on the authorities. No one in Pueblo went to bed feeling safe. That was because someone had entered a house owned by the Drain family, and it was nighttime and the parents were at a dance. Their two daughters, Dorothy and Barbara, were sound asleep at home. A madman entered the house and bludgeoned them with an axe, killing Dorothy and severely injuring Barbara. Cheyenne Sheriff George Carroll, looking at Joe, thought he was a misfit. Not only was he disheveled in appearance, but the young tearaway wasn't exactly descriptive when talking about what he'd been doing the past few weeks. With some grilling, Joe confessed to the crime, although the tactic of intense police persuasion was embraced. On August 27, 1936, people picked up the Reading Eagle newspaper, and on the front page, in bold capital letters, they saw the headline, "Youth Confesses Attacking Girls." The second paragraph of the story read, "Joe Arity, 21, arrested here last night as a vagrant, confessed," Sheriff George Carroll said, "to the murder." He said also, according to the sheriff, that he'd killed Barbara Drain, 12. The younger, however, was not killed, but is still unconscious in a Pueblo hospital, her skull crushed. The report went on to say that Joe had confessed to planning the murder, waiting for the parents to leave the house, and then going inside and hacking the girls with his axe. This came as quite a shock to a man named Arthur Grady. He was the Pueblo police chief, and he already had a guy in a jail cell for the brutal slaying. That guy was Frank Aguilar, an employee of Mr. Drain. When the cops searched Aguilar's home, guess what they found? An axe that looked like it could have been the weapon used in the crime. Now we'll look at another newspaper headline, this time in the Greeley Daily Tribune. The headline read, "Aguilar says he murdered Drain child." The article explained that Aguilar confessed to the crime by marking an X next to two 5-page confessions. The other confession was also marked with an X, but an X written by Joe Arity. The story goes on to say that Arity had escaped from a home for the mentally defective, and that later the two men had met the night of the murders and plotted to do the awful deed. Another part of the story read, the confessions were made under the questioning of Warden Roy Best. Don't forget that name. The article failed to mention few very important things, matters you could say were of mortal importance. At first, Aguilar had said he had never seen Joe Arity before in his life. Only after some of that infamous persuasive police questioning, he changed that statement to being with Joe when the girls were killed. Another giant omission was the fact that Joe hadn't said a word in the transcript of the confession. All the talk came from Aguilar. In 1937, Aguilar was convicted of the crime and was subsequently executed, but at least some people knew something wasn't quite right with Joe's signing of the confession. Even so, his lawyer tried to argue that he wasn't guilty by reason of insanity, rather than fight the case for his absolute innocence. Think about it. There wasn't an actual transcript of Joe's confession, which is a big deal. Also, there was no evidence that put Joe close to the Drain house on the night of the crime. It also came to light that Joe had said he killed the girl with a club, not an axe, as if he'd been led on when he first talked to Sheriff Carroll. Still, the lawyer went for the insanity defense. It didn't work, which is not surprising because it rarely does, then and now. But when 3 state psychiatrists testified in the case, something else came up. That was the fact that they all said that Joe had the mental age of a 6-year-old. His IQ was 46, which back then made him an imbecile. Such a word is just formal medical lexicon in those days, just as retard was. Joe wasn't quite an idiot in the now obsolete classifications, but he also didn't qualify as a moron. Still, the psychiatrist said he was incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong and therefore would be unable to perform any action with a criminal intent. But what about his spoken confession to Sheriff Carroll? Was it right that a man with the brain capacity of a little child should be convicted of murder for something he said under police duress? Of course it wasn't, but the police could get away with more venality back then than they currently get away with. When Barbara Drain recovered from her injuries, she wasn't suffering from amnesia and so could talk about what happened on the night. Things looked good for Joe because she said the guy in her bedroom was the man that worked for her father, Frank Aguilar. She also said she didn't recall Joe being there on the night of the attack. It didn't seem to matter. Joe was convicted of murder and sentenced to die in the gas chamber. He wasn't alone, however, and there were numerous appeals. Attorney Gail L. Ireland got behind him and said the evidence stated that Aguilar had first said he committed the crime alone. Furthermore, Ireland said, "This other guy you've got locked in is so mentally challenged that he doesn't even know what execution means. Believe me when I say that if he is gassed, it will take a long time for the state of Colorado to live down the disgrace," said Ireland in court. The appeal seemed to work for a while, as did all the other petitions flooding in. Just as the execution was around the corner, a stay was granted. In fact, 9 stays were granted in all, but those are just temporary delays. What Ireland and all of Joe's supporters wanted was an exoneration, and that was looking possible the more support that Joe received. Meanwhile, Joe was in his cell on death row playing with his toy trucks and sending his wind-up train past the doors of all the other prisoners' cells. He actually seemed to be enjoying himself, probably because for the first time in a while he had a place to sleep and was getting warm meals on a regular basis. Warden Roy Best, who was there when Aguilar and Joe wrote those X's, was the one that gave Joe the toys. Why hadn't he said anything about Joe's mental state before if he felt so sorry for him, you might be wondering? That's not an easy question to answer. Best became known as the most notorious warden in Colorado history. He flogged prisoners, he tortured them with other terrible punishments, and when he thought someone was homosexual, he made them wear a dress and push a wheelbarrow full of bricks around all day. Nevertheless, he had a progressive side too. He developed educational programs so the prisoners might get a job once released. He ensured women prisoners were kept safe from dangerous male prisoners, and he even introduced a dental care program in the prison. It seems he also stood by prisoners who were mentally disabled. Still, Joe didn't need more toys or caring words from the warden. What he needed was the state to do something unusual and admit mistakes had happened. This never comes easy. Like many people who criticize the justice system say, it's often winning that counts, not justice. And as time passed, even with all the petitions and support from Best himself, the state was starting to look like a winner. January 5, 1939, the Reading Eagle published another article about Joe. The headline read, "Condemned prisoner to give train to another slayer." The story called Joe weak-witted and said he had the intelligence of a 6-year-old, but it didn't question that injustice might have occurred, and instead called him a slayer. The article said that when the warden went to Joe's cell to tell him that his death was impending, the only thing Joe said was, "Give my train to the guy in the other cell." The newspaper described this other guy, Angelo Agnes, as a Denver Negro condemned for slaying his wife. Best told the paper that Joe had told him, "If I go, yes, give my train to Agnes." He actually didn't really know what the gas chamber was, although he did have some understanding of dying. He had said to Best, no, Joe won't die. January 6, 1939, prison chaplain Father Albert Schaller walks into Joe's cell. As soon as he looks at Joe again, he knew a travesty of justice was about to happen. The chaplain watched Joe eat the ice cream, the food he'd asked for when asked what he wanted for his last meal. He couldn't actually comprehend what that meant, of course. When the chaplain read Joe his last rites, he had to do it very slowly and only 2 words at a time so Joe could repeat the words. The chaplain tried to hold back his emotions, but his eyes were filled with tears. When the chaplain explained to Joe what was about to happen, Joe just looked at him with a blank bewilderment. When led out of his cell, the last thing he did was hand over the train as promised. He started to get nervous when being walked toward the execution room with about 50 other people. He might not have known what the gas chamber was, but he could sense something unusual was happening. He started to shake on the way, only to be calmed down when the warden Best held his hand. "Do you understand, Joe?" asked Best. "They're killing me," Joe replied, still looking like a confused child. When he entered the room, he was strapped into the chair. At that point, he was grinning nervously. When a blindfold was put over his eyes, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't smiling at all. He was petrified. The warden and the chaplain said goodbye. Joe muttered bye, trembling as he did so. Then all he heard was the clanging of the steel door closing, the airtight chamber filling with cyanide as Joe waited, wondering what they were doing to him. January 7, 1939, a headline in the St. Petersburg Times read, "Happiest man in death cell dies." The story went on. The 23-year-old youth, described as having mental age of 6, was pronounced dead 6 1/4 minutes after cyanide pellets were dropped into an acid jar beneath the chair to which he was strapped. The warden said after, he probably didn't even know he was about to die. It should have been big news. It should have upset the nation, but then newspaper headlines in bigger print than Joe's had the names Hitler and Mussolini in them. People had other concerns. In the decades to come, though, people still talked about this massive injustice, a crime committed by those supposed to protect us. Finally, in 2011, Colorado Governor Bill Ritter issued a pardon for Joe, saying there had been a tragic conviction based on a false and coerced confession of a mentally disabled man. He added, "Pardoning Arity cannot undo this tragic event in Colorado history. It is in the interests of justice and simple decency, however, to restore his good name." Skin splitting open, veins blackening, flames erupting from the eyes. What happens when an execution fails or goes horribly wrong? We'll start with a very recent case, one which involves some failure, but the authorities managed to succeed in the end. We're including it just to give you an idea of what can go wrong. The condemned man was Angel Nieves Diaz. He'd been convicted of a murder, which he always said he was innocent. His last words were, "The state of Florida is committing a crime because I am innocent." The death penalty is not only a form of vengeance, but also a cowardly act by humans. Prior to that, he had some turkey and cheese tacos for his final meal. At Florida State Prison, he was strapped to the gurney. The authorities injected the drugs and waited, and then waited some more. Then they watched as Diaz's arm went black from chemical burns. Then after 10 minutes, obviously in pain, he muttered, "What's going on?" Now, you think the state would have stopped the execution then and there, but no. In this case, they just kept going. After 24 minutes, when Diaz should have been long dead, his head jolted. His eyes then opened wide, giving a fright to all the people watching. Diaz was cheating death. Again, if you are that way inclined, you might think some higher power wanted to save him. He choked, and then people said his skin ripped. It was a terrible thing to behold. An expert later talked about his injury, saying, "That's the kind of injury we see when a kid has fallen in a campfire or set his arm on fire. My guess is someone who got this when alive would need skin grafts to heal." That person described the injuries as skin slippage, which is a term you probably never want to hear again in your life. He also said he'd never seen anything like it. Then after 34 minutes, a doctor wearing a COVID mask rushed in to check Diaz's vital signs. He was dead, but you have to ask how they could let him suffer like that. Why didn't they call it off? After all, it was evident that the execution was botched. A reporter who was there said for a long time Diaz's mouth was flexing like a fish out of water. Now let's go back in time for a famously failed execution. An executioner at Exeter Prison in England puts a white hood over a condemned man's head. He then fastens a belt around his ankles. That man, shaking, whispering prayers under his breath, braces himself and gets ready to depart. From a nearby window, the governor is watching, just as the executioner pulls the lever, and then nothing. Believe it or not, the condemned man, John Babacombe Lee, went to the scaffold on 3 occasions, and each time the device failed to work even though the executioner had gone through all the routine checks. There didn't seem to be a problem. Nonetheless, the trapdoor each time failed to open. Lee became known as the man they couldn't hang. His story is even more mind-blowing when you consider the fact that his conviction for murder was based on some very suspect evidence. Right up until the time he was walking to that scaffold, he claimed he was innocent. Again, if you're so inclined, you could say some divine intervention took place, but the likely reality is the machine had a faulty drawbar which prevented the trapdoor from opening. Either way, Lee was probably innocent of that murder, so the right thing happened in the end. In fact, when the judge asked him if he had anything to say about his death sentence, his exact words were, "The reason why I'm so calm is that I trust in the Lord, and He knows I am innocent." Someone surviving 3 separate executions is kind of amusing for us now, but imagine how Lee felt all those 3 times. The experience must have been awful. Still, Lee later wrote that on attempt number 3 he just wanted a quick death, saying the suspense was becoming unbearable. "I wanted them to get it over at any price." You might also ask, how could the authorities do that 3 times? Surely there must be some kind of executioner ethics manual to follow? What about that thing called cruel and unusual punishment? In Lee's case, though, his torment was seen as cruel. After the 3rd attempt, the authorities said he'd been through enough. The British Home Secretary explained why, saying Lee was not reprieved because the merits of the case justified the step, but because of the miserable bungle which was made in attempting to hang him. But that was back in the day. Some botched executions have been worse than that, and most of them have taken place in the US. As you'll see today, some folks in the country have pretty much been fried in the electric chair, their hair ablaze, their bones shuddering, and not yet died as expected. Others have been injected with that killer poison and still came out breathing. Did those guys like Lee receive a get-out-of-death card too? Can you actually sue the authorities for messing up your execution? Surely even prisoners have rights when it comes to causing them incredible pain and emotional anguish. Well, in some cases they do call it off. When that happens, killing someone turns into trying to save someone's life. It's actually believed something like 7% of lethal injection executions are botched in the US, but perhaps the worst one involved a man named Clayton Lockett. His case was exceptional. He was also given a lethal injection of drugs. In case you don't know, the cocktail has 3 potent drugs. One part should knock the person out, the next bit should make him paralytic, and the last part should stop his heart. On a good day, that is. It should work, but judging the correct doses involves a bit of guesswork, and the person doing the guessing sometimes isn't a medical professional. The Atlantic explained, these officials base their confidence that a certain drug will work largely on the fact that it has seemed to work in the past. Lockett, a convicted killer, was given his lethal injection. By all accounts, the prison had had difficulty getting the drugs. This is why things didn't go to plan. They also used a sedative that wasn't usually used, called midazolam. In fact, a paramedic later told the press that lots of things seemed wrong that day. She said the syringes were the wrong size and the tubing on the IV was not the right kind. Nonetheless, Lockett was strapped down in the death chamber while waiting for the drugs to be administered. The paramedic stuck in the needle and blood flowed into the barrel. So far, so good. But then the IV came loose, and she tried to put the needle in again. It didn't work this time. Lockett had been an intravenous drug user, something that had damaged his veins. The paramedic later said she was told if you fail 3 times to get the needle in, you have to give up and let someone else do it. A doctor stepped in to help, which shouldn't happen, given that docs swear on the Hippocratic Oath never to cause someone harm. He didn't like the look of Lockett's arms, but then he saw the perfect vein in his neck. He turned to the paramedic and said, "Get me a needle for the jugular." As he was trying to stick the needle in Lockett's neck, the paramedic was working on his arms. Failure again, so the doc tried to find a vein in Lockett's groin. It was starting to look very bad. Then they brought out longer needles, and still they failed. And that's when the doctor asked for something called an IO infusion needle, described by the media as a kind of power drill that gets right into the bone instead of a vein. Now, embarrassed, they asked Lockett if he was okay. He replied, "I was going to see if I could get my mouth wiped off." They then finally got a vein. Lockett said he had no last words, after which the warden said, "Let the execution begin." The sedative was pumped into him, but the IV came loose and most of it went right into his tissue, not the vein. So he wasn't knocked out. He was evidently conscious of what was going on. He then seemed to go to sleep, so as usual the lights brightened and it was time to check if the condemned was completely sedated. He wasn't. The doctor even pinched him to try to get a reaction. He then said he's knocked out enough, so they injected the killer part of the cocktail. Then, when Lockett should have been dead, he twitched. He looked as though he wanted to talk. His legs moved. His hands moved. He was evidently in pain. The warden later said he thought, "My good God, he's coming out of this." He was. He lurched forward trying to get off the gurney. At that moment, the witnesses were in utter shock. Lockett's lawyer even started crying. Lockett was now twisting violently and trying to speak. His heart was only beating 20-something times a minute, but he was very much alive. He finally did manage to speak, saying one word, "Man." The doctor then lifted up the sheet and saw a massive ball had formed in Lockett's groin area. It was a ball of the drugs. Blood was also running down his thighs, but they didn't stop. The paramedic told Lockett to take a deep breath as she tried to get the needle back into place. She then told the doctor, "You've hit an artery." As if things couldn't get any stranger, they then talked about giving Lockett CPR and taking him to the hospital. The paramedic later said that the point was to kill him, not save his life. Subsequently, the doctor asked the warden what to do, to which the warden replied, "Is there another vein available? And if so, do you have another set of chemicals back there?" The doctor said no to both questions. It was only then that they decided to stop the execution. That was officially decided, so now the doctor and the paramedic raced to save Lockett's life. They weren't fast enough. He died 10 minutes later after having a heart attack. The Lockett family later sued the prison, the executioners, the drug makers, and even 2 pharmacies. They said the new drugs that were used pretty much constituted human experimentation, something the Nazis might have done back in the day. Human rights activists said the state had disgraced itself before the nation and the world. The execution was called barbaric by many. Even the White House said it fell short of humane standards. So why didn't they just give up and kill him on another day? The reason is that takes time, and a botched execution is a bad look for the authorities. And in this case, they did, after a long time, at least stop the execution. It just took too long. If Lockett had survived, unlike the case of Mr. Lee's bad hanging, he would have been executed at a later date. Probably. We'll explain later why we say probably. Not all cases are alike. Lethal injection became the execution of choice in the USA because it was said to be more humane and dignified than getting shot or fried or hanged. But let's face it, the best way to go would have to be having your head chopped off by that highly reliable machine called the guillotine. The authorities seem to think that is barbaric. But as you'll now see in gory detail, the electric chair is the worst killing device of them all. Way more barbaric than a sharp blade taking off your noggin. The chair that the convicted killer John Lewis Evans sat in was actually made by an inmate at that prison. It was nicknamed Yellow Mama. Evans was first blasted by 1900 volts of electricity, which should have killed him, and it didn't. And what witnesses saw was nothing short of terrifying. The official report later said sparks and flames erupted from the electrode. His body slammed against the straps holding and his fist clenched permanently. A large puff of grayish smoke and sparks poured out from under the hood. An overpowering stench of burnt flesh and clothing began pervading the witness room. The doctors went over to his smoldering body and declared him very much alive. They then hit him with more shocks, after which witnesses said the smell of burning flesh was nauseating. The doctors went over to him again, and he was still alive. One doctor then got on the phone with the state governor and said this guy suffered so much that the execution meets the criteria for cruel and unusual punishment. This should, in any execution case, mean it has to be called off. But the governor wasn't in the mood that day to grant the smoldering man clemency. The final hit actually killed him. A similar thing happened to Jesse Tafaro when he was executed in 1990. Generally, when things go right, the condemned person is hit with around 2,000 volts for a period of about 30 seconds. After that, the doctor waits for the body to cool, then goes to check if the guy is dead. In the case of DeFaro, it took 3 jolts to finish him off. It turned out the authorities had used the wrong kind of sponge to put over his head, which meant poor conductivity. Old Sparky malfunctioned. Witnesses said flames rose out of DeFaro's head before his heart finally stopped. One witness later said, 7 minutes is a long time to watch someone burn. The entire operation actually lasted 13.5 minutes. And you're now starting to understand, the authorities don't easily back out of an execution. Never mind how bad one gets, but it has happened. In 2018, the state of Alabama tried to kill Doyle Ham, a man convicted of killing a motel clerk during a robbery. When the big day arrived, they couldn't find a vein since Ham had developed a bad case of lymphatic cancer while on death row. For 3 hours, they prodded him with needles, which Ham's lawyer said constituted torture. The doctor's report used in court said, during this time, Mr. Ham began to hope that the doctor would succeed in obtaining IV access so that Mr. Ham could get it over with, because he preferred to die rather than continue to experience the ongoing severe pain. He won the case and settled with the state. No way could he be executed again, but he had to spend the rest of his days in prison. It said he was the 3rd person ever to survive a modern execution. Another guy that could put that on his resume was convicted child abductor Romel Broom. In 2009, the state of Ohio stuck 18 different needles into the man as he howled in pain. He even tried to help them find a vein, while at the same time, the people administering the drugs could be seen patting him on the back and saying something along the lines of, "There, there." They couldn't get the job done, so they decided to call it a day. But in that case, the condemned man was just given another execution date, even though his lawyers said he'd already been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, and he should at least serve a life sentence. That didn't happen. Broom was handed another execution date, but COVID got him before the drugs could. The other person to survive lethal injection was named Alva Campbell. This convicted killer had been quite fond of his cigarettes during life, which resulted in him suffering from lung and prostate cancer and COPD. The diseases made it hard to get the drugs in him. He cried in pain as they stuck needles into him, and after 25 minutes, the execution was called off once they'd had approval from the governor. In just about every case, this approval is necessary to stop the execution. A date was set for another attempt, but 3 months later, Campbell died from his various ailments. Okay, but has anyone ever survived the electric chair? In 1947, 17-year-old convicted killer Willie Francis did just that. He beat Old Sparky. It was a sham trial in the first place. The only evidence they had was putting Francis near the scene of the crime. Cops said he had the victim's wallet, but during the trial, they couldn't produce evidence to prove it. Francis's attorney hardly supported him at all, asking for no witnesses while not objecting to anything. They didn't actually defend Francis, who was only 15 years old at the time. When the day came and he was sent to the chair, this one called Gruesome Gertie, the guard who set things up was a drunk on the job. The machine worked, which was evident with Francis shouting, take it off, let me breathe," behind his leather hood. He certainly got a very painful shock, but the chair didn't do the job properly and they had to call the execution off. His punishment was called cruel and unusual, but prosecutors argued that there was no intention to torture the boy. A young lawyer defended Francis, and he said under constitutional law, Francis should not be subjected to that cruel punishment again. The Supreme Court in this case had to make a decision, the same decision that had been considered for other stories we told you today. That is, did what happened cause pain that was not necessary and so violate the prisoner's due process rights, or cause cruel and unusual punishment? The decision was 5-4 to put Francis to death again. The court said, the cruelty against which the Constitution protects a convicted man is cruelty inherent in the method of punishment, not the necessary suffering involved in any method employed to extinguish life humanely. The fact that an unforeseeable accident prevented the prompt consummation of the sentence cannot, it is seen to us, add an element of cruelty to a subsequent execution. The decision was actually used in other cases when people survived a painful execution only to find themselves in the same position months or years later. Francis died in the chair almost exactly 1 year later. When asked if he had any final words, he said nothing at all. He was pronounced dead after 5 minutes. In this video, you'll learn about a killer clown's KFC feast, a strangler's rage at his missing SpaghettiOs, a white supremacist murderer's final act of diabolical food-based spite, and so much more. These are some of the most insane death row last meals. You'll hear about each of these convicts' heinous crimes and the deranged meals they decided to go out with. We'll warn you though, this video will make you horrified and hungry. Let's start off with Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. This former Florida carnival worker was found guilty of first-degree murder and false imprisonment in 1986. Bolin was a serial killer sentenced to life in prison and eventually to death for the killing of Stephanie Ann Collins, age 17, Natalie Hawley, age 25, and Terry Lynn Matthews, who was 26. Bolin Jr.'s crimes were sadistic and gruesome, like something from a primetime detective thriller. Collins and Matthews were both found wrapped in white sheets after having been stabbed or slashed repeatedly, and having their skulls crushed. And the scariest part is that he almost got away with it and may have even killed again, were it not for another crime he committed, being a terrible husband. In 1982, before he began his killing spree, he committed a campaign of abuse and terror against Cheryl Hafner, whom he married a year later in 1983. He'd go on to commit his first murder in 1986, committing less lethal assaults against other women afterwards, and killed his other 2 victims that same year before separating from Cheryl in 1989. Bolin Jr.'s goose was cooked when Cheryl told her next husband about her ex's violent behavior and murderous bragging. When Cheryl's new hubby called the police tip line, these terrible acts of violence were put to an end. In 2016, Oscar Ray Bolin Jr. was put to death for his crimes, a full 3 decades after murdering the young women. He was 53 and executed via lethal injection. For his final meal, Bolin was reported to have ordered a ribeye steak, which he wanted to be cooked medium rare. He also asked for a baked potato with butter and sour cream, a salad that specifically had tomato and cucumber on the top, garlic bread, and a bottle of Coca-Cola as a beverage. For dessert, Bolin asked for a slice of lemon meringue pie. That's pretty sweet, unlike the crimes of our next contestant. A man named Earl Forrest found himself on the receiving end of the death sentence in Missouri for a series of murders he committed on the night of December 9, 2002. Forrest, who had apparently been drinking earlier that night, entered the home of one Harriet Smith, a woman who allegedly had agreed to buy a mobile home and a lawnmower for Forrest after he had introduced her to a source for supplying methamphetamine. During an ensuing altercation, Forrest shot Smith 6 times, killing her as well as a guest of hers named Michael Wells by shooting him in the head. After stealing $25,000 worth of methamphetamine, Forrest returned home, where a shootout with police ensued, resulting in the death of Deputy Joanne Barnes. Forrest also shot both Sheriff Bob Woodford and his own girlfriend, Angela Gamblin. However, both would thankfully survive their injuries. Charged and found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, Earl Forrest would spend 11 years on death row. When the time finally came for his last meal, he chose to eat pasta, steak, tomatoes, cucumbers, a side of fruit, and a slice of chocolate cake, washed down with a glass of milk afterward. Now there's an idea for a Got Milk commercial that would probably never get approved. Next on the menu is one Ronnie Lee Gardner, a man sent to prison in 1980 for robbery, only to escape in 1981. When confronting a man who had been in bed with Gardner's girlfriend, he was wounded by a gunshot and arrested after being returned to prison. But not for long. Gardner would escape once again in 1984 after being taken to the hospital for a checkup, overpowering a guard and taking his pistol. He would kill a man named Melvin Otterstrom, who tended the bar at the Cheers Tavern in Salt Lake City, Utah. A year later, in 1985, Gardner was being transported from Utah State Prison to the courthouse to attend a pre-trial hearing for the second-degree murder of Melvin Otterstrom. It was upon entering the courthouse that an accomplice, Kara Jolly Hainsworth, handed him a revolver she'd smuggled inside in order to help Gardner pull off his latest escape attempt. She'd even hidden a bag containing a change of clothes, duct tape, and a knife for the man on site. What ensued was a chaotic firefight that saw Gardner shot through the lung by guards before he took the life of an attorney, Michael Burdell, by shooting him. Gardner would take several hostages, including prison guards and even a vending machine serviceman, shooting and seriously wounding a bailiff before being made to surrender by armed police outside the building. Gardner would spend a quarter of a century waiting to be executed for his crimes, receiving life in prison for his murder of Otterstrom before being sentenced to death in 2010 for killing Burdell. His request for a final meal was hardly a one of everything on the menu list, but it was certainly pricey. Gardner intentionally fasted for 36 hours, only drinking liquids, before sitting down to his final dinner of expensive surf and turf, lobster tail, and steak. In addition, he was given a 7-Up to drink alongside and an apple pie with ice cream for afterward. He also made the request to be allowed to watch a showing of Lord of the Rings as he ate. Ronnie Lee Gardner would soon after be executed by firing squad, making him the 3rd person in Utah to receive this penalty after the suspension of the death penalty was lifted in 1976. We hope you enjoyed Lord of the Rings even half as much as our next guy loves meat. It's often been said that it's hard to maintain being vegan or vegetarian since there's a scarcity of widely available and affordable options that fit those lifestyles. Luckily, there are at present a slowly increasing number of foods on the market for vegan and vegetarian folks, but the number of options tends to go up when it turns out a person has been lying about being a vegetarian the whole time. That brings us over to Stephen Michael Woods, who murdered a young couple in 2001, Ron Whitehead, who was 21, and Bethina Brose, who was 19. Both were shot multiple times in the head by Woods and had their throats cut as well. Yikes. Woods and an accomplice, Marcus Rhodes, were found to be in possession of personal items belonging to the couple, along with the murder weapons being uncovered at the home of Rhodes' parents. Multiple witnesses testified that Woods had spoken about his plans to commit the two murders and even spoke about his participation afterwards. While Marcus Rhodes was charged with capital murder and pleaded guilty, receiving life in prison, Stephen Woods was sentenced to death by lethal injection on August 27, 2002, in Texas, with his execution ultimately taking place on September 13, 2011. Despite having made earlier claims of being a vegetarian, Woods' final meal was full of meat, without so much as a fruit or vegetable in sight. Then again, he also claimed to have not killed Ron Whitehead and Bethina Bros, despite the evidence to the contrary. So maybe he just had a fraught relationship with the truth in general. His last meal consisted of 2 entire pounds of bacon, a large pizza topped with sausage, pepperoni, and every other type of meat you can imagine. He also had 4 fried chicken breasts, 5 chicken fried steaks, 2 hamburgers also topped with bacon, as well as French toast and garlic breadsticks with marinara on the side. Woods also received 2 pints of ice cream and a lot of sugary beverages to go with his meat-heavy meal, including 2 bottles of Mountain Dew, Pepsi, root beer, and sweet tea. If someone filmed this whole process, it would have been a video that was half Green Mile and half Epic Meal Time. There's a vintage YouTube reference for you. Woods wasn't the only one who wanted to do the do on his last 24 hours of Earth. The particularly despicable criminal Richard Cooey was sentenced to death for the sexual murders of 2 college students in 1986 and remained on death row for 20 whole years for a bizarre reason. By his own claim, at 5 feet 7 inches tall, weighing 270 pounds, he was too fat to safely execute. But sadly for Cooey, the state of Ohio found a way. When he was executed in 2008, he decided to go out with a meal that'd make your inner Cheeto dust-coated gamer proud. A T-bone steak with A1 sauce, onion rings, hash browns, French fries, toast with butter, 4 eggs over easy, a pint of Rocky Road ice cream, Bear Claw pastries, and Mountain Dew. When you're about to die, after all, it's not like you need to be watching your weight, right? We've got some even crazier examples to come, but at this point you might also be wondering, where did this tradition of the last meal even come from in the first place? Why do we give our most diabolical criminals a choice of a meal before going on to execute them anyway? It can't have just sprung out of nowhere, right? While some might misattribute this to the Last Supper within the Christian Bible, the tradition of giving a prisoner their final meal actually predates Christianity, dating all the way back to ancient Greece. Back then, it was likely born of the belief that a person sentenced to execution had to be fed so their spirit could cross over the river Styx without the risk that they would return from the underworld. Wouldn't want someone put to death to return as a vengeful, hungry ghost now, would you? This practice would later spread to ancient Rome, where gladiators were provided with a feast before the grueling experience of entering the Colosseum as a way to celebrate life before potentially facing death. Though personally, we're not sure we'd want to risk engaging in gladiatorial combat on a full stomach. You're supposed to wait at least 15 minutes, aren't you? That might actually be swimming. With this being a tradition going back to the ancient world, why isn't this video hours long with hundreds upon hundreds of crazy examples of last death row meals? Well, because some areas either saw this kind of thing coming or learned their lessons pretty quickly and put restrictions on the kinds of things that death row inmates can request. What kinds of restrictions, you might ask? Well, that depends on where in the country someone is sentenced and incarcerated while awaiting the death penalty. In Florida, for example, the maximum budget for a final meal is $40 US, while in Louisiana and Oklahoma, it's less than half that amount. Certain requests are also denied due to prison restrictions, especially for those who might ask for alcohol or cigarettes to accompany their meal. Anytime a prisoner's request cannot be fulfilled, substitutions are usually made. So if someone on death row was to ask for a Wagyu steak or a lobster, they likely wouldn't get it, and someone looking to dine out on a sirloin steak might receive a hamburger patty. That's all the prison had on hand. So with that context out of the way, let's return to some more of those crazy last meals. We've certainly all known our share of picky eaters. Perhaps you, watching this at home, are even one. Remember how we said that sometimes prisons will make substitutions for items if they don't have them available? Well, this might be the story of the infamous instance of that ever happening. And it couldn't have happened to a pickier eater. Thomas J. Grasso broke into the home of an elderly woman from Tulsa, Oklahoma, named Hilda Johnson. On Christmas Eve of 1990, Grasso attempted to steal Johnson's cheap television set and a meager $12 from her purse and around the house. In order to do so, he murdered the 87-year-old woman with her own Christmas lights and bludgeoned her with an iron. Later in July of 1991, after selling Johnson's TV for only $125, Grasso would also murder Leslie Holtz, an 81-year-old man who lived in the same boarding house in Staten Island. Grasso then stole the man's social security check. He was given a life sentence in New York, where there is no death penalty. However, he would later be extradited back to Oklahoma for killing Hilda Johnson, pleading guilty to her murder and being sentenced to death in March 1995 as a result. This, technically, made Grasso's death the first execution of someone convicted in New York State in over 30 years. But for his last meal, Grasso didn't quite get everything he asked for. He certainly didn't hold back on ordering a veritable feast, requesting to be given 24 steamed mussels and 24 steamed clams, along with a double cheeseburger from Burger King and half a dozen barbecue spare ribs. He had not only one but 2 strawberry milkshakes to pair with his meal, as well as half of a pumpkin pie with whipped cream and diced strawberries. The real sticking point, though, the thing that really irked this multiple murderer and picky eater, was an issue over, of all things, SpaghettiOs. Yeah, you heard that correctly, SpaghettiOs. As part of his final meal, Grasso had specifically requested a 16-ounce can of SpaghettiOs with meatballs to be served at room temperature. Not even warm? Gross. However, the prison substituted this with regular canned spaghetti and meatballs instead, leading Grasso to become incredibly incensed. He was so aggravated by this substitution that in his final statement to the press before receiving the lethal injection, Thomas J. Grasso was quoted as saying, "I did not get my SpaghettiOs, I got spaghetti. I want the press to know this. Turns out there really is no pleasing some people." Of course, it'd be remiss of us to make a video on expensive last meal requests and not mention yet another prolific serial killer, John Wayne Gacy, also known as the Killer Clown, though he never actually killed anyone while dressed as a clown. His renown among his community in Chicago dressing up as a clown for local children might have garnered him a nickname that sounds like it was ripped straight out of a Stephen King novel, but don't let that fool you. Gacy was a monster of a man, one of the United States' most notorious killers, and guilty of some truly horrific crimes. In 1978, he was convicted of the murder of 33 teenage boys, 27 of whom he had buried in his backyard and in the crawl space beneath his home in the Chicago suburbs. For 12 of his murders, Gacy was sentenced to death, having already been given life in prison for the others. His execution was appealed, albeit unsuccessfully, and the Supreme Court of Illinois ruled that he was to receive the death penalty by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Before his sentence was carried out, John Wayne Gacy would receive a last meal that mainly consisted of a large bucket of KFC original recipe fried chicken. During his life, Gacy had actually managed 3 KFC franchises in Waterloo, Iowa, an association that KFC was probably pretty upset about after all those murders came about. Alongside the fried chicken, he also had French fries, fried shrimp, and an entire pound of strawberries. Strangely, KFC and other fried chicken meals are a popular request among those on death row, with chicken fried steak being one of the most requested dishes in last meals. It's not the most requested final food, though. That title goes to ice cream. Yummy. Speaking of tasty frozen treats as a last meal, one of the most infamous domestic terrorists of all time had a hankering for something creamy and cold for his closing munch. In 1996, Timothy McVeigh committed the Oklahoma City bombing, where he filled a truck full of high explosives and detonated it next to a government building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, a crime for which McVeigh showed no remorse whatsoever. When he was executed in 2001, his last meal was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. And personally, before he faced lethal injection, we hope he got brain freeze too. In the interest of balance, it's worth noting that some condemned killers end up ordering surprisingly Spartan last meals. For example, Eileen Wuornos, one of the rare female serial killers who killed as many as 7 victims, decided not to have a last meal and instead just ordered a cup of black coffee before her execution in 2002. This is similar to the last request of Fritz Haarmann, a frighteningly early 20th century German serial killer who was executed in 1924. As was the custom of German capital punishment of the time, he was only told his execution date the night before it happened. He was given an expensive cup of Brazilian coffee and a cigar before his head was chopped off by a guillotine. There are some last meals that leave you feeling the effects of eating them long after you're done. And for this next entry, the lasting after effects of his final meal would be felt not just by him, but by everyone else on death row in the state of Texas. Lawrence Russell Brewer was a white supremacist found guilty of murdering a black man named James Byrd in Texas in 1998. Along with his 2 equally contemptible friends, Brewer would beat and torture his victim before chaining James Byrd to his pickup truck, then driving the man, who was fully conscious during this time, 3 miles until he was killed by a curb, and his body dismembered. A documented member of the Confederate Knights of America and the Ku Klux Klan, this vile individual was found guilty of a hate crime and sentenced to death on September 23, 1999. Brewer was to be executed by lethal injection on September 21, 2011, but it was his expensive and extravagant last meal that would send ripples through the state of Texas's prison system. He ordered 2 chicken fried steaks, along with a large bowl of fried okra, a triple bacon cheeseburger, 3 fajitas, a cheese omelet, and a pound of barbecue with half a loaf of white bread. He also requested an entire meat lover's pizza, 3 root beers to drink, as well as a pint of ice cream and a slab of peanut butter fudge with crushed peanuts for dessert. And the kicker? Brewer didn't actually eat any of it. After requesting the elaborate spread, he then refused to have a single bite, wasting all of the food. The expense wasn't just monetary either. In fact, his disgusting actions would lead to Texas outright banning final meals for inmates on death row. And as of 2011, when Brewer was put to death, the state no longer fulfills requests for special meals. The state senator who called for an end to the practice, John Whitmire, went so far as to say, "If you're fixing to execute someone under the laws of the state because of the hideous crime that someone has committed, I'm not looking to comfort them." Perhaps the greatest insult of this case isn't just that Brewer ordered an extravagant meal and refused to eat it, meaning no other Texas prisoners were afforded the option of a last meal, but the fact is that this is what Brewer is remembered for. It's acknowledged far less often than his despicable, brutal hate crime that resulted in the death of James Byrd. But Lawrence Russell Brewer isn't the only infamous serial killer who didn't feel all that peckish before his state-mandated demise. One of the United States' most sadistic and infamous killers, Ted Bundy, didn't make any food requests before his execution by electric chair in 1989. Because of this, he got the default Florida death row meal of steak, eggs, toast with butter and jam, hash browns, coffee, and juice, all of which went to waste because Bundy decided not to eat any of it. He was causing trouble until the very end. However, when it comes to sheer death row gluttony, few can match the last meal of convicted murderer Peter J. Minial. After refusing a plea deal and sending his trial to a jury, Minial's devastatingly wrong miscalculation resulted in him landing on death row. However, despite his attempts to save his own life failing miserably, Minial decided he'd go out with style, or more likely an extreme case of acid reflux. He ordered 20 tacos, 2 kinds of ice cream, 20 enchiladas, 2 double cheeseburgers, fried chicken, pizza, and a fruitcake. If you're a particularly food-motivated person, you might now be thinking, that sounds pretty delicious, but you need some real impressive drinks to wash that down. You might be on the same wavelength as Minial because, in addition to all that grub, he also ordered orange juice, root beer, Pepsi, and Coca-Cola. Yummers. That brings us to maybe the most expensive last meal ever requested. In 2005, Robert Dale Conklin was scheduled to face execution in Georgia. He'd been on parole for armed robbery and fell into an altercation with George Crooks, an attorney who was reported to have been Conklin's lover. During the altercation, Robert Dale Conklin stabbed George Crooks in the ear with a screwdriver, wiggling it around and then later dissecting Crooks's body. Conklin wrapped the remains in garbage bags, leaving them in a dumpster outside his apartment, even putting some of the body parts down in a waste disposal unit. A book on dissection of the body was even found in Conklin's bedroom when the police investigated after a maintenance worker at the apartment complex discovered the dissected body parts, as well as a number of George Crooks's belongings inside the garbage bags. Conklin was condemned to execution by lethal injection, which was scheduled to take place on the 12th of July 2005, 21 years after the murder took place in 1984. Before receiving a sedative, a lung-paralyzing drug to slow his breathing, and a dose of lethal potassium chloride, Conklin was granted a last meal. And to call that a last meal might well be an understatement. It was an entire feast. For his last meal, Conklin requested and received a filet mignon wrapped in bacon, as well as shrimp sautéed in garlic butter with lemon. He also had a baked potato with butter alongside sour cream, chives, and bacon bits. Oh, and there was more. Corn on the cob, asparagus with hollandaise sauce, French bread with butter, and goat's cheese. For his dessert, Conklin had a cantaloupe, apple pie, and vanilla ice cream, and washed the whole lot down with an iced tea. Despite being thin in stature, Conklin ate everything, clearing 2 whole plates. To this day, his is still considered to be one of the most expensive, if not the single most expensive last meal requests. Now, is anybody else feeling hungry after hearing all this? 19-year-old Colleen Slemmer lies motionless on the cold ground. Blood pools around her lifeless body, and her injuries are so savage, so grotesque, that the man who stumbles upon her can't tell if he's looking at a person or an animal. As he steps closer, the horrifying truth emerges. Etched deep into her exposed upper body is a pentagram. Dirt and blood cover every inch of her lifeless body. He freezes. The weight of the discovery slams into him. He is looking at a girl, a brutally murdered girl. Heart pounding, he shakily dials the police, desperate for help. It was a scene of unspeakable horror, a crime that would send shockwaves across the nation. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we unravel the gruesome details of this case and the person behind such a crime. Krista Pike, the youngest woman on death row. Krista Gale Pike was born in West Virginia on March 10, 1976. Today, she is on death row in Tennessee, held under maximum custody at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center. Despite its innocent-sounding name, the center is actually a women's prison under the Tennessee Department of Corrections. But Krista Pike's story doesn't end with just one crime. She is not only in prison for Colleen Slemmer's brutal murder, her record includes multiple felonies that paint a picture of a deeply troubled life. So, what drove her to commit such a shocking act? And why was Colleen Slemmer the target of such unimaginable violence? To understand this chilling case, we need to go back to the very beginning. Krista Pike's life started in chaos. Born into a very dysfunctional family with plenty of substance abuse issues to boot, her mother, Carissa Hansen, showed little interest in raising her, leaving young Krista to fend for herself emotionally. Meanwhile, her father, Glenn Pike, took things a step further, completely rejecting her. Shortly after Krista's birth, Glenn walked away, starting a new life with a new wife and family. When Krista tried to visit her father, she was often turned away, barred from seeing the family he had chosen over her. Carissa, on the other hand, worked a lot and then preferred to spend her free time partying with friends rather than caring for a toddler. Krista's aunt, Carrie Ross, gave a lot of details about her niece's early childhood. Ross said that when she visited the house, she would often find Krista crawling through piles of dog stool and other garbage. One time, Ross was out with Krista's mom when Carissa received a call that the 14-month-old Krista was experiencing seizures, something that would eventually land her in the hospital. Carissa hung up the phone and kept on drinking at the bar instead of going home to her child. So, all in all, Krista Pike had far from the best home life. There was one bright spot, though. At some point, Carissa, who at least had realized she wasn't much of a mom, sent Krista to live with her paternal grandmother. Krista seemed relatively happy in this house for most of her childhood years, as her grandmother treated her well, and the two had a very close bond. She believed her grandmother was the only person that had ever really loved her. So when her grandmother passed away in 1988, 12-year-old Krista was left devastated. Days later, she tried to take her own life. It's no surprise that those closest to Krista recall her spiraling out of control around age 12, and her family, of course, didn't help. There were rumors that her grandmother's boyfriend and a few of her mother's several boyfriends had treated her inappropriately and perhaps even abused her physically and sexually. Her family argued against those claims, saying that Krista was a pathological liar and had made up claims of abuse. But considering her family was either high, unreliable, or had little to no contact with Krista, their word doesn't mean much. Plus, one of her mother's boyfriends was arrested for whipping a preteen Krista, so Krista might have had a point. This may be why at age 12 she threatened one of her mother's boyfriends with a butcher knife. Perhaps uncoincidentally, that was the same boyfriend who had whipped her. During Krista's eventual trial, her mother Carissa owned up to a lot of the blame for Krista's troubled childhood. She admitted to drinking heavily and abusing drugs, letting Krista down repeatedly during her early years, and eventually causing her bad behavior. And as she grew up, Krista's behavior went from bad to worse. She threatened to run away from home if Carissa didn't let Krista's boyfriend move in with her. So he did. Krista's rebellion didn't stop there. She eventually began stealing from her own mother, straining their already fractured relationship. Yet, despite her troubled behavior and chaotic upbringing, Krista demonstrated remarkable intelligence. Dr. Eric Engum, a psychologist who would later examine her, noted she had an IQ of 111, well above average. As far as her father Glenn was concerned, he would occasionally let Krista back into his life during this time, but when one of her half-sisters said that Krista had molested her, Glenn sent her to boarding school. Eventually, in an attempt to get her life back on track, Krista joined the Job Corps, a job training program for low-income youth to help them enter the workforce and start earning money. This is where she would meet her eventual victim, Colleen Slemmer. Even though they found themselves at the same place, Colleen and Krista could not have been more different. Born in Pennsylvania on September 20th, 1975, Colleen was raised in a loving household by her mother and stepfather, along with her younger sister. After she finished high school, Colleen wanted to go to college, but it was too expensive. Since she was interested in computers, and the Job Corps had a program specialized in computers, she decided she would try her luck there instead. What began as a simple clash of personalities soon escalated into outright hostility. Krista was convinced Colleen had her sights set on her boyfriend, Tadaryl D. Shipp, a suspicion that quickly festered into deep resentment. Krista and Tadaryl had met in the Job Corps program and bonded over their shared fascination with Satanism, a dark interest that seemed to fuel their connection. To Krista, Tadaryl was everything, and the thought of losing him, especially to Colleen, drove her paranoia to dangerous extremes. All of Colleen's friends insisted that was not the case, and Colleen herself was confused as to why Krista thought this, since she hadn't done or tried anything to do with Tadaryl. But nothing would convince Krista otherwise, and this went beyond simple jealousy. Colleen called her mother once and told her that she was terrified of a girl at Job Corps because that girl was out to get her. Colleen said she woke up one night to this girl, who she never named, standing over her with a knife and accusing her of trying to steal her boyfriend. However, Colleen needed to continue her program, and if she did report Krista's behavior, nothing was ever done about it. Then on January 12, 1995, Colleen's future with her Job Corps classmates suddenly seemed brighter. Krista reached out to Colleen and asked if she wanted to hang out, maybe go to Blockbuster and pick up a movie. Colleen, happy that her self-appointed enemy was finally getting along with her, quickly accepted. The teens signed out of their dormitory and went on a walk, along with Tadaryl and another girl, Shadala R. Peterson, when Krista offered to smoke some weed with Colleen to make up with her. So, they made their way toward Tyson Park, off the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. When they got to a relatively quiet, isolated place in the woods, the mood changed. Krista quickly turned on Colleen, accusing her again of trying to steal her boyfriend, who was awkwardly standing right there. Colleen denied it again and again, but Krista wasn't listening. Then she started hitting Colleen, threw her to the ground, and started kicking her repeatedly. Colleen cried out, "Why are you doing this to me?" and threatened that she would report Krista to the Job Corps program. Krista responded by kicking her in the face. Colleen tried to get up and run away, but Tadaryl caught her and threw her back to the ground. Shadala was a short distance away from all this, as she had been told to stand aside as a lookout. Suddenly, Krista pulled out a number of weapons, including a box cutter and a miniature meat cleaver she had borrowed from someone. Krista slashed at Colleen, cutting her in the stomach, causing her to scream in pain. According to Krista's testimony later, she said she then stood over Colleen for a while, just watching her bleed. When Colleen tried to run away again, Krista slashed her on the back. As the attack went on, Krista's co-conspirators started getting nervous. They thought, or at least they told the police they thought, that the whole plan was only to scare Colleen. Now they realized Krista was taking things much, much further. At some point, Colleen started begging for her life, telling Krista that if she just let her go, Colleen would leave the Job Corps and never look back. This got through, on some level, to Krista's humanity, as she told Colleen to shut up, since it's harder to hurt somebody when they're talking to you. Krista, consumed by rage, began slashing at Colleen's throat. As the brutal attack unfolded, Colleen begged for her life, until she tried to run away one last time. As Colleen got up to run, Krista realized that if her victim gets away and tells the Job Corps about the assault, Krista will be kicked out and will most likely go to jail. For Krista, this couldn't happen. So she grabbed a chunk of asphalt that was laying nearby and brought it down on Colleen's head. Before leaving the scene of the crime, either Krista or Tadaryl carved a pentagram in Colleen's chest and then dragged her body over to a patch of dirt. The next morning, a university employee stumbled on Colleen's dead body. Sickened by what he discovered, he immediately called the police. Police arrived on the scene and determined that the girl on the ground had been tortured for between 30 minutes to an hour before she was killed. As they looked around the area, they also had to keep expanding the crime scene. Signs of a fight, drag marks, and handprints in the mud, as well as broken branches, were everywhere. Then they took the body to the station and cleaned her up, then made a definite ID that it was Colleen Slimmer. And they had a feeling finding her killer wouldn't take long, because Krista Pike had made it really easy for them. For one thing, she showed up at the scene of the crime after the police had arrived. Officer Harold James Underwood Jr. testified that Krista came up to him with a few other girls and asked what had happened. After hearing about the murder, she asked who the victim was, and if the police suspected anyone yet. No one else in her group spoke. Officer Underwood said her behavior was really suspicious, since she was asking for details about the murder while giggling and looking amused. She also had a necklace with a pentagram on it, which was the same symbol carved into the victim. Officer Underwood told his superiors about Krista and her strange behavior, and they started asking around the Job Corps. Once again, Krista helped them build a really airtight case against her because she had spent the entire day after the murder bragging to people that she had tortured and killed Colleen. Her classmates weren't on board with any of this and immediately told the cops who were asking around that Krista had done it. Apparently, Krista had been talking about killing Colleen for a few days, but no one had taken it that seriously until it happened. Krista, Tadaro, and Shadala were taken in for questioning. Shadala turned on the others almost immediately, and once Krista was told that her other friend was talking, she confessed to the murder in horrible, excruciating detail. She also said her blood-stained jeans were still in her room, and she had given the miniature meat cleaver back to the person she had borrowed it from, leaving a trail of evidence all over the place. Unsurprisingly, Krista Pike was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder, and it wouldn't be the only felony charge in her life, but you'll find out about her other shocking crimes soon. Krista's trial started in early 1996. Her family actually testified on her behalf, essentially admitting they were such bad parents that they're partly to blame for her behavior. While almost no sane person disagrees with them, the judge and jury also didn't think it was enough to excuse torturing and murdering an innocent person. Next, Krista's defense attorneys alleged she had suffered from mental disorders like bipolar disorder, and that made her unable to understand the consequences of her actions. But Dr. Engum said that all of his tests showed that Krista was sane and had no brain damage that would excuse her violent behavior. He did point out that she had a very severe borderline personality disorder, which probably influenced her rage and jealousy, as well as some symptoms of drug abuse, especially of inhalants. Dr. Engum thought Krista had lost control during the attack, and it may not have been premeditated. But the fact that Krista lied to Colleen to lure her to the woods and then ignored her cries for help while torturing her for almost an hour were too much for the jury to overlook. To convict Krista of first-degree murder in Tennessee, there had to be aggravating circumstances. The prosecution argued that in this case there were two. First, the murder was especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, and that it involved torture or serious physical abuse beyond that necessary to produce death. And second, the murder was committed for the purpose of avoiding, interfering with, or preventing a lawful arrest or prosecution of the defendant or another. The evidence against Krista was overwhelming. The brutality of the crime alone satisfied the first condition for a first-degree murder charge. But it was Krista's own words that sealed her fate. She admitted that one of her motives for killing Colleen was to silence her, preventing her from reporting the assault and getting Krista expelled from the Job Corps program. This admission highlighted not just the calculated nature of her crime, but the lengths Krista was willing to go to protect herself, ensuring the first-degree murder charge would stick. On March 22, 1996, the jury was asked to start deliberations. They deliberated for just a few hours before concluding that Krista Pike was guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. On March 30th, the court decided on her sentence, death by electrocution. Her co-conspirators also received sentences. Tadaro got life with a possibility of parole, plus 25 years for the conspiracy charge, and Shadala got probation for pleading guilty to being an accessory after the fact, and had given the cops all the evidence they needed to convict Krista and Tadaro. But Krista Pike's verdict was shocking to some, even given how serious her crime was. The fact that Krista Pike was barely a legal adult when she killed Colleen, 18 years old at the time, made some anti-death penalty groups lobby to give her a life sentence instead. Her lawyers appealed the conviction based on 8 alleged mistakes made during the trial, but the state was unsympathetic. On October 5, 1998, they found no serious errors had been made during the trial, and death row was appropriate, considering the nature of the crime and the defendant. The state set her execution date for August 19, 2002. Krista's legal team decided to file an appeal in July of 2002 to delay her execution and hopefully get her conviction overturned. However, Krista hadn't made their job easy because in August 2001 she tried to kill a fellow inmate, Patricia Jones. Krista attacked Patricia with a shoelace, strangling her until she almost died. So not only did her lawyer's 2002 appeal not work, but Krista actually went on trial again for her murder attempt against Jones. In August 2004, she was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years. Krista's lawyers attempted to get a retrial in 2008, but were denied. In 2014, Krista's team made a last-ditch attempt to get her off death row. Krista's lawyers argued that her age and mental state played a significant role in the crime. At the time of the murder, she was incredibly young, and they claimed mentally underdeveloped. They also pointed to a history of mental illness, which had been exacerbated by years of harrowing physical and sexual abuse throughout her childhood. These traumatic experiences, they argued, had shaped her psyche and contributed to the actions that led to her heinous crime. The defense sought to portray Krista not as a criminal but as a deeply damaged individual shaped by circumstances beyond her control. In 2019, the court read the appeal and denied it. For the last time, Krista Pike was officially out of chances to appeal her case, but she could still try other ways to escape her circumstances. One of her lawyers, Angela Bergman, filed a lawsuit against the state of Tennessee in 2022 to get Krista better living conditions. Due to Pike's unique circumstances, she was basically in solitary confinement, even though officially she wasn't. In Tennessee, death row inmates are separated from the general population, but they can still work jobs, spend time together, eat together, and go outside of their cells, subject to good behavior. But since Krista Pike was the only woman on death row in Tennessee, she didn't get to do any of that. Bergman argued that being kept in a cell the size of a parking space 22 to 24 hours a day had absolutely destroyed Krista's mental state. Krista actually won this lawsuit, and her lawyer celebrated the small victory, saying this not only means a reprieve from decades of harmful and unconstitutional conditions, but an opportunity to have a meaningful, positive impact on those around her. Things got so bad during her solitary confinement that in the small windows of time when Krista could see people, she decided to plot her escape. At some point during her prison stay, Krista started writing letters back and forth with a personal trainer named Donald Kohut. The New Jersey man struck up a friendship with the prisoner that eventually got really close and intense. He started making the 900-mile journey to visit Krista in prison in Tennessee. Eventually, they decided they wanted to have a real relationship, which meant she'd have to get out of prison. In March 2012, New Jersey authorities arrested Kohut when they found evidence that he, along with a prison guard and Krista herself, were plotting her escape. 34-year-old Kohut was charged with bribery and conspiracy to commit escape, as was 22-year-old Justin Heflin, a guard at Krista's prison. The guard was also charged with facilitation to commit escape. Heflin's family said that Kohut had threatened his life, and that was the only reason he was helping with the escape plot. Authorities said Heflin had helped simply because he was getting bribed to do so. Whatever the case was, the escape attempt had been interrupted before it could even begin, and Krista, to the relief of many, would remain behind bars. At this time, Krista's future seems bleak. She has no possibility of parole, and the fact that she tried to murder another prisoner works against any good behavior claims on her part. Still, she is on death row, but many prisoners sit on death row for decades without even facing the electric chair. The state of Tennessee hasn't executed a woman for 2 centuries, so she may never actually get put to death. In fact, since the beginning of the modern era of the death penalty, which started in 1976, only 18 women have ever been executed in the entire United States. But on August 27, 2020, Tennessee Attorney General Herbert Slattery asked for a final execution date to be set for Krista Pike. Her lawyers kept asking for extensions, as usually happens in death row cases, and eventually asked for her death sentence to be overturned altogether. According to her legal team, executing Krista Pike goes above and beyond any punishment she should receive for her crime, as personnel would be required to execute a severely mentally ill, brain-damaged, and traumatized child who became the teenager who committed a terrible crime. They also pointed out that if she's put to death, she would be the first teenaged offender to be executed in modern times. Will the arguments work? Well, it's possible, as Tennessee has previously reversed a female inmate's death sentence. Gail Owens was supposed to be put to death on September 28, 2010, for paying a man to kill her abusive husband. But in that case, both local and national groups campaigned to overturn her death sentence, since the man she killed had been abusing her and putting her life in danger. In response, Governor Phil Bredesen overturned her sentence, and Owens was released on parole about a year later. However, Krista Pike doesn't have the same degree of support from people. Her victim wasn't an abusive husband, but an innocent classmate her age who had done nothing to her.
Wyoming, 1911. The sun shines down on a baseball diamond as a pitcher throws a fastball that doesn't go in the intended direction. He stamps a foot on the ground, enraged that he's messed up again. What he does over the course of this game is literally a matter of life and death. He's not just playing to win, he's playing to survive. As are his teammates, all convicted felons playing for the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars in the city of Rawlins. Murderers, robbers, men who've committed heinous crimes against the vulnerable, playing like seasoned professionals. This ragtag bunch of thugs and killers can play, there's no doubt about that. But the question is, can they win their way to a new life? Let's go back to the start.
When the Wyoming State Penitentiary was opened in 1901, it was one tough place. This was a time when the West was called wild, and the outlaws pervaded the land. Still, not long before the prison was opened, you could say that criminals faced a rougher kind of justice if apprehended. Take, for instance, the story of the killer and robber Big Nose George Parrott. He was arrested in 1881 and was sent to the local jail in Rawlins. Big Nose, who certainly had quite the snout, must have thought his luck was in when he busted out of that jail. But it turned out that his rescuers were a local lynch mob. These townfolk weren't willing to wait for the authorities to deal with him. Around 200 of them strung Parrott up from a telegraph pole. Physicians managed to get hold of his body, but get this, his skull ended up being someone's ashtray, and parts of his skin were made into a death mask and a pair of shoes. The third governor of the state of Wyoming, Mr. John Eugene Osborne, actually wore them to his inaugural ball. If that sounds grim, you should know that many crazy things went down these days. Opening a penitentiary for housing prisoners there was somewhat more progressive than mob rule. Still, if you found yourself locked up around the time of the beginning of the 20th century, you could be sure that you weren't getting much sympathy from the townspeople you had stolen from, beaten up, or killed. No one blinked an eye when rustlers and murderers were treated inhumanely by a well-respected, eminently wealthy businessman named Otto Graham. You could say that this man made hay while the frontier crime rate was off the scales. He had a contract with the prison in the early days and pretty much ran the place. For every criminal that entered the prison, he received 57 cents per day per prisoner from the state. But he also ran the prison's broom factory and took all the profits from that. Inmates at the time complained that Graham was a man from the Dark Ages, saying that he had made the men work ungodly hours and barely fed them. They drank out of tomato cans and were given just enough food to prevent starvation. Rancid food at that. So, in the first decade of the 1900s, Wyoming State Penitentiary was hell on earth. But for Graham, it was a goose laying a lot of golden eggs. Not surprisingly, morale in the prison was low. Prisoners had tried to escape and were killed while doing so. They killed each other, and on occasions, guards were murdered. In 1911, the progressive Senator Joseph Carey campaigned to get rid of Graham, and after he won the governor's race, he made Sheriff Felix Alston the big boss in the prison. This man, who'd been a gold miner, a water and ice man, a farmer, a national park guide, and a justice of the peace before becoming a sheriff, didn't believe that working the prisoners close to death was a way to fix their wicked ways. The broom days were over, and instead of hard labor, prisoners were educated and also entered intense physical fitness programs. When they weren't doing those things, they were sent out in gangs to fix the state's roads. This was a breath of fresh air to the prisoners, some of whom had never even been outside since the prison opened. They were no longer making brooms and pining for a square meal, but were being fed and enjoying activities in the prison yard. What activity did they enjoy most? Baseball, of course, the USA's favorite sport at the time. One day, Warden Alston was watching the men play and he thought, God damn it, some of those men ain't half bad. In fact, he mused while watching the men hit balls over the wall and throw curveballs that some of them would stand a chance of becoming professional. Alston got talking to his old friend, Governor Carey, and asked him if it'd be okay if the prison formed a baseball team. Carey wondered if forming a prison team could be a bit of fun, and he gave Alston the green light. Carey was also partial to gambling. This will tie into the story soon. The men were bought brand new uniforms and practiced as if they were professional players. They called themselves the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars. And while the public thought the whole thing was a farce, the inmates would not only prove them wrong, but would change the public's perception of them. One person that absolutely hated the fact that the team had been made was Graham, who still held the belief that prisoners needed to be treated like animals. Not only that, he had the hopes that one day he might start his ultra-profitable broom operation again. It was arranged that the All-Stars would play their first game against a local team called the Wyoming Supply Company Juniors. No one gave them a chance, of course, because how could prison criminal vermin organize themselves and beat a team filled with real athletes? Imagine hearing the lineup. Leroy Cook at first, bludgeoned to death a barber and stole his money. On second, George Sabin, convicted of second-degree murder. On third, Jack Carter, who shot and killed an old hermit, cut him up and burned his remains in the fireplace. Pitcher William Boyer stabbed his father to death with a letter opener. The date was set. On July 18, 1911, a team consisting of murderers, rapists, a forger, and 5 thieves would go up against the mighty Wyoming Supply Company Juniors. Alston had high hopes, so high that he put down quite a large bet that his team would win. The stakes were also high for the team. If you won this game, they might well get time off their sentence. But if they made a mistake that cost the team the win, well, no time off. and not much chance of them having their sentence commuted. That meant a life or death game for some of the death row prisoners, and by God, they took it seriously. They didn't want to end up having their skin made into a pair of shoes, a story that no doubt haunted them. They didn't just win the game, a game against one of the best teams in the area. They absolutely trounced their opponents and did it playing with style and as gentlemen. The final score was 11-1 to the All-Stars. They were over the moon, not only because they'd achieved something great, but because it was looking like hard time was about to get softer. The outstanding player on the team was Joseph Sang. He hit 2 home runs, with one being a grand slam. If you're not a baseball fan, that means hitting a home run when there are men on bases 1, 2, and 3, thereby scoring 4 runs. It's about as good as it gets. The newspapers the next day were busy publishing stories about a bunch of convicts that had somehow turned into formidable baseball players. Referring to Sang, the Washington Post wrote, "Slayer scores home runs." The first paragraph said, "Joseph Sang, right fielder, is under sentence to be hanged." Sang made 2 home runs hit over the penitentiary wall. One of his hits cleared the bases, bringing in 3 others and scoring himself. Sang was on death row for killing his supervisor in the street. Well, the victim wasn't only his supervisor, he was also the husband of the woman that Sang loved. This is what another newspaper wrote about him. Joseph Sang, who was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death, played a classy game all the way through. He will petition the governor to commute his sentence to life imprisonment sometime this month. In fact, when people read about Sang's brilliance, a lot of them sympathized with him. Okay, he had killed a man, but some people had said, hey, he isn't exactly public enemy number 1, he killed out of love, and man, he's a great athlete. Surely the state could commute his death penalty. Rumors started to catch fire. Word on the street was that if Sang could keep on playing like a star, he might get what he wants. But there were others on the team that hoped for some mercy for their efforts. One of them was Captain George Sabin. The tale thickens here. You see, Sabin was arrested after he killed 3 sheep herders. He snuck up on them one night and shot them all dead, which really were cold-blooded killings. The thing was, though, those slayings were part of a long dispute between herders and cattle ranchers that had taken other lives. These conflicts were known as the Sheep Wars. There were actually local politicians that thought Sabin was in the right for doing what he'd done. Let's not forget, this was the Wild West. Another thing was the fact that Sabin was actually a friend of the prison ward in Alston. It had been Alston that arrested him, and while he didn't want to put a close friend behind bars, he really didn't have much choice. He got 25 years for his crime, but was made the captain of the team and was allowed to leave the prison at times. What did he do when he was on the outside, you might wonder? Well, much of his free time was spent going around to the local saloons and brothels and talking to men who liked to make bets. He then told them all about his crack team of players and just how good Sang was. Sabin would take 20% of their winnings if they bet. He was also in cahoots with Alston, whose money was used to place bets of his own. Well, when Mr. Graham, the broom man, got wind of this, at first he was appalled, and then later he wondered if he couldn't report the matter. He got in touch with Senator Francis Warren, a man who was hoping to oust Kerry as governor. While Graham had no proof that Kerry was in on the betting, he believed it to be true. Meanwhile, the guys on the team were having the time of their lives. They were eating better food than the rest of the prisoners, and they moved more freely around the prison. They played the same team again, and they won easily. Superstar Sang was the man of the hour another time, hitting balls right, left, and center. The score was the same as the first time, 11-1. But as prisons go, even today, one man's good luck is another man's torment. Sang was to be executed soon, even though he still had the public on his side, even though he was winning games. Then one day, an envious prisoner thought that he'd move forward that execution date all by himself. He saw Sang sitting on a landing at the bottom of some stairs, and with an iron ball fastened to his legs, he climbed to the level above Sang and pushed over a heavy box of sand. It would have hit and killed Sang had he not at the right moment moved to the side. They won their next game 11-4, and again Sang was the standout player, hitting home runs with as much ease as a major league player playing against a junior high school team. 3-0, and Sang was the hero every time. Surely they'd not hang him by a rope. As the team were basking in the glory, inmates had been trying to escape. Having a baseball team practicing in the prison and going out for games wasn't making life easy for the guards. It created more chaos. Sang also now needed to be protected, which took up even more of the guards' time. It wasn't really his fault, but it bugged some of the inmates that he was getting special treatment. His execution date arrived, and lo and behold, he wasn't sent to the gallows. Some inmates gossiped that the only reason that happened was because he was due to play and was making a lot of money for someone. They won their fourth game against the same team, but not with as much ease as they'd won the other games, the final score being 15-10. Over the course of 15 months, they won time and again, raking up a total of 39 wins and 6 losses, with each game being played in front of raucous supporters. In total, $136,000 had been bet on them, which is almost $4 million in today's money. It's thought that a lot of the winnings went into the pockets of local politicians and their election campaign funds. The heat was on Governor Carey, a man whose reputation was at risk after Graham had started those rumors about him placing bets. It's likely because of that Carey announced that he was cracking down on gambling. Soon after, the All-Stars were a thing of the past. Alston said that baseball would be replaced with educational programs, which seems to have suited a lot of the other prisoners not on the team. As for Superstar Sang, well, at least he got to live a little longer than he would have if he hadn't hit balls out of the park. It wasn't good enough, though, and he was hanged on May 24th, 1912. 350 locals had petitioned the government to commute his sentence, but it didn't work. The man that once hit a ball through a third-story window in the guards' quarters of the prison wasn't going to escape the dreaded noose. Before his death, Sang said, "I never received a square deal until I was brought to the penitentiary." He was grateful for having been able to play the game he loved, at least for a short while. At 2:45 a.m., the moonlight shining on the gallows, he took his final breath. The local newspaper wrote the next day, his steps were steady, and he went to his death in a manner which stamped him as a brave man.